Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Welsh countryside had always felt like a place where secrets buried themselves deep, waiting for the right moment to claw their way back to the surface. When I first laid eyes on Brin Cottage, nestled between rolling hills that seemed to watch with ancient eyes, I thought I'd found exactly what I was looking for: isolation, silence, and the kind of peace that comes from being forgotten by the world. Mrs. Griffiths, the landlady, was a woman carved from the same weathered stone as the cottage walls. Her hands moved constantly as she spoke, kneading invisible dough or wringing invisible water from invisible cloth. She showed me through the cramped rooms with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this dance many times before, though something in her manner suggested most tenants didn't stay long. "Breakfast is at 7 sharp," she said, her voice carrying the musical lilt of Welsh English. "No visitors after 9, and mind the stairs at night. They creak something terrible." The room she led me to was on the second floor, small but clean, with a narrow bed pressed against one wall and a window that looked out over the sheep-dotted hills. Above, I could see the peaked roof of the cottage, and when I asked about the space up there, Mrs. Griffith's hands stilled for just a moment. "Just the attic," she said, then resumed her invisible ringing. "Nothing up there but old beams and dust. Haven't been up there in years myself." That first night, I slept better than I had in months. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant bleating of sheep and the whisper of wind through the eaves. I'd come to Wales to finish my dissertation on medieval Welsh poetry, seeking the kind of solitude that London could never provide. The cottage seemed perfect for my needs, remote, quiet, and mercifully free from the constant hum of modern life. It was on the second night that I first heard them. I woke to the sound of footsteps directly above my head, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth across what I assumed was another guest room. The steps were soft but distinct, the kind made by someone trying to move quietly, but not quite succeeding. They traced a pattern: 5 steps toward the window, a pause, then 5 steps back toward the door, over and over, with the mechanical precision of a metronome. I lay in the darkness, listening, waiting for the footsteps to stop. They continued for perhaps 10 minutes before finally fading into silence. In the morning, I mentioned it to Mrs. Griffiths over breakfast. "Another guest?" she asked, her hands already busy with the sugar bowl, straightening spoons that didn't need straightening. "No, love, just you this week. Probably just the house settling. Old places like this, they make all sorts of noises." But her eyes didn't quite meet mine when she said it, and her hands moved faster, more agitated. The third night brought the same pattern: 5 steps, pause, 5 steps back. The rhythm was so consistent it seemed almost ritualistic, as if whoever was walking up there was following some ancient prescribed path. I found myself counting along, anticipating each footfall, each pause. When I finally drifted back to sleep, I dreamed of walking in circles, trapped in an endless loop of 5 steps forward, 5 steps back. During the day, I tried to focus on my research, spreading medieval manuscripts across the small desk by the window. But my attention kept drifting upward, studying the ceiling, trying to make sense of the layout above. The cottage was old, probably 18th century, with the kind of confusing architecture that comes from centuries of additions and modifications. From the outside, the roof suggested a substantial space above my room, but Mrs. Griffiths had been adamant that it was just an attic. On the 4th night, I decided to investigate. The footsteps began at exactly midnight. I'd started checking my watch, and I was ready for them. I slipped out of bed and crept to the hallway, my bare feet silent on the worn carpet. The cottage felt different at night, older somehow, as if the darkness stripped away the veneer of domesticity and revealed something more primitive underneath. I found the narrow staircase leading up at the far end of the hall, almost hidden behind a door I'd assumed led to a closet. The stairs were steep and narrow, the kind that would have been servants' stairs in grander houses. Each step creaked under my weight despite my careful movements. and I winced at every sound, afraid of disturbing whatever was walking above. At the top of the stairs, I found another door, this one standing slightly ajar. Pale moonlight leaked through the gap, and I could hear the footsteps more clearly now. They were just on the other side of the door, pacing their eternal pattern. 5 steps, pause, 5 steps back. I pushed the door open and stepped into the attic. What I found made my blood freeze. There was no floor. The space above my room was exactly as Mrs. Griffiths had described. Nothing but exposed beams stretching across the darkness like the ribs of some massive beast. Moonlight filtered through a small window at the far end, illuminating the skeletal framework of the roof. Below the beams, I could see the ceiling of my room, and below that, the impression of my own bed pressed into the shadows. But the footsteps continued. I stood there in the doorway, my heart hammering against my ribs, and listened to the impossible sound of someone walking across a floor that didn't exist. The footsteps were coming from the space directly above my room, but there was nothing there except open air and wooden beams. 5 steps toward the window, pause, 5 steps back toward where I stood. I retreated down the stairs, my legs trembling, and spent the rest of the night sitting in the chair by my window, staring up at the ceiling. The footsteps continued until dawn, never varying in their pattern, never acknowledging the physical impossibility of their existence. The next morning, Mrs. Griffith's hands were in constant motion as she served breakfast, her fingers drumming against the table, straightening and re-straightening the cutlery. "Sleep well?" she asked, not looking at me. "I went up to the attic last night," I said carefully. Her hands stopped moving. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock. "Did you now?" she said finally. "Nothing up there but beams, like I told you." "Yes," I said, "just beams." We ate the rest of breakfast in silence. That day, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress, isolation, the power of suggestion, all perfectly reasonable explanations for what I thought I'd heard. I threw myself into my research, transcribing old Welsh verses until my eyes burned. But as evening approached, a familiar dread settled into my bones. The 5th night brought a change. The footsteps began as usual, but this time they seemed more urgent, more agitated. The pauses between the 5-step patterns grew shorter, and occasionally I could swear I heard other sounds. A soft scraping, as if something was being dragged across that non-existent floor. Then, around 2 in the morning, the footsteps stopped directly above my bed. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, as something seemed to press down on the ceiling above me. The plaster creaked softly, and I watched in horror as a small shower of dust rained down onto my blankets. Whatever was up there was heavy, real enough to stress the old ceiling joists. The pressure lasted for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then it lifted, and the footsteps resumed, but now they sounded different, more deliberate, more aware. As if whatever walked that impossible floor had finally noticed the man lying in the bed below. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning I packed my bags. Mrs. Griffiths wasn't surprised when I told her I was leaving. Her hands performed their endless dance with the breakfast dishes as she nodded absently. "Shame," she said. "Lovely spot for writing this. Very inspiring." "How long since your last long-term guest?" I asked. "Oh, we get visitors all the time," she said. But her voice carried that same careful quality I'd noticed before. "Mostly hikers, people passing through. Not many stay more than a night or two." "And the attic?" She paused in her dishwashing, her hands finally still. "Like I said, nothing up there but old beams and dust." She turned to face me, and for the first time since I'd arrived, looked directly into my eyes. "Some houses have long memories, love. Sometimes it's best not to go looking for what they remember." I left Brin Cottage that afternoon, driving down the winding country road with my manuscript boxes loaded in the back seat. In my rearview mirror, I watched the cottage shrink into the distance, its windows dark and empty. But just before it disappeared entirely behind a fold of hills, I could swear I saw a figure silhouetted in the small attic window. a shadow moving back and forth in that familiar pattern. 5 steps toward the glass, pause, 5 steps back into darkness. I never finished my dissertation on medieval Welsh poetry. Every time I tried to work on it, I found myself listening for footsteps, counting rhythm in my head, waiting for the soft creak of joists that shouldn't be able to bear weight. I returned to London, found a flat in a modern building with thin walls and noisy neighbors, the kind of place where every sound had a rational explanation. Sometimes late at night when the city finally quiets down, I still hear them. 5 steps forward, pause, 5 steps back. I tell myself it's just the upstairs neighbors, or the building settling, or the pipes in the walls. But deep down, I know better. Because whatever walks the floors that don't exist doesn't care about distance or logic, or the comfortable boundaries between the possible and impossible. It simply is, has always been, will always be, pacing its eternal path above the heads of those who dare to listen. And sometimes, in the small hours before dawn, I wonder if I ever really left that cottage at all. If perhaps I'm still lying in that narrow bed, staring up at the ceiling, while something that shouldn't exist walks back and forth above me, waiting for me to finally understand what Mrs. Griffiths tried so gently to tell me. Some houses have long memories, and some memories walk. Story 2. The first thing you notice about the Casa de los Espejos isn't its crumbling Baroque facade or the way tropical vines have claimed its outer walls like desperate fingers. It's the silence. Even in the heart of Vigan's bustling heritage district, the colonial mansion sits in its own pocket of absolute quiet, as if sound itself recoils from its weathered stones. I should have recognized that silence as a warning. My name is Rafael Santos, and I came to the Philippines 6 months ago with a restoration contract that promised to resurrect this 300-year-old Spanish colonial masterpiece. The local historical society had been searching for someone with expertise in both Baroque architecture and tropical preservation techniques. My portfolio from similar projects in Salvador and Ouro Preto made me their ideal candidate. What they didn't mention in our correspondence was that I'd be the 4th architect to attempt this restoration in the past decade. The others had simply left. No explanations, no forwarding addresses, just abandoned contracts and half-finished restoration plans gathering dust in the Historical Society's filing cabinets. Standing before the Casa de los Espejos on that first sweltering morning in January, I felt something shift in my chest, a subtle tightening that I attributed to excitement. The mansion's 2-story structure loomed against the blazing sky, its traditional Filipino-Spanish architecture a testament to colonial fusion. Capiz shell windows caught the early light like clouded eyes, and the distinctive steep-pitched roof showed centuries of weathering from typhoons and tropical storms. But it was the stained glass that truly captivated me. Set into the mansion's upper gallery were 3 magnificent panels, each nearly 8 feet tall. Even through the grime and decades of neglect, I could make out intricate religious scenes rendered in jewel tones. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. European techniques adapted with local materials and sensibilities. These weren't just windows, they were masterpieces that had somehow survived 3 centuries of earthquakes, wars, and abandonment. The interior was a maze of hardwood floors warped by humidity, hand-carved furniture shrouded in dust sheets, and walls lined with mirrors in ornate frames. Hence the house's name. Every surface seemed designed to reflect, to multiply, to create the illusion of infinite space within the mansion's solid stone walls. Walking through those first rooms felt like moving through a kaleidoscope of memory and shadow. I set up my temporary office in what had once been the main salon, positioning my drafting table near the largest stained glass panel. The morning light filtering through the colored glass painted my workspace in shifting hues of amber, crimson, and deep blue. It was there, surrounded by centuries of accumulated silence, that I began to catalog the mansion's extensive damage and plan its restoration. The work consumed me completely. Days blended into weeks as I documented structural issues, researched original construction techniques, and coordinated with local craftsmen. The Historical Society had been generous with their budget, understanding that a restoration of this magnitude required both time and meticulous attention to detail. I found myself working increasingly long hours, often staying until well past sunset, when the stained glass panels no longer caught the light and the mansion settled into its evening stillness. It was during my third week that I first noticed them. I had been working late, hunched over architectural drawings by the light of a portable lamp, when peripheral movement caught my attention. Looking up, I saw what appeared to be a human silhouette reflected in the stained glass panel before me. The figure was clearly defined: shoulders, head, the suggestion of arms, but completely without features, as if someone had cut a person-shaped hole in reality itself. My first instinct was to turn around, expecting to find someone standing behind me. The salon was empty. When I looked back at the stained glass, the shadow was gone. Fatigue, I told myself. Too many 18-hour workdays and too little sleep. I packed up my materials and called it a night, but the image of that featureless silhouette lingered in my mind as I walked back to my hotel through Vigan's cobblestone streets. The next morning brought news of a minor earthquake, magnitude 4.2, centered about 60 kilometers northeast of the city. The tremor had been barely perceptible, but it was enough to rattle windows and send a few items tumbling from shelves across the region. At the mansion, I found my carefully organized workspace in slight disarray, papers scattered, and my lamp knocked onto its side. What unsettled me more than the earthquake's minor damage was the timing. The shadow in the stained glass had appeared the evening before the tremor struck. I tried to dismiss the connection as coincidence, but the human mind has a peculiar talent for recognizing patterns, even when logic suggests there are none defined. Over the following days, I found myself glancing at the stained glass panels more frequently, searching for movement that shouldn't exist. My growing preoccupation began to affect my work. I would lose track of time staring at the colored glass, studying the intricate religious scenes while simultaneously watching for shadows that had no right to be there. The restored sections of the mansion seemed to highlight the areas still in decay, creating a patchwork of renewed beauty and persistent deterioration that felt somehow symbolic, as if the building itself were caught between states of being. The second sighting occurred exactly 2 weeks later. I had been cataloging damage to the mansion's original hardwood flooring, when late afternoon light began streaming through the stained glass in particularly vivid shades. The entire salon was bathed in jeweled radiance, and for a moment, I allowed myself to simply appreciate the breathtaking beauty of light transformed by centuries-old craftsmanship. That's when I saw them. Not one shadow this time, but 3. Distinct human silhouettes reflected in different sections of the stained glass panel, each one perfectly formed but utterly without features. They stood motionless, as if waiting, and something about their posture suggested attention focused in my direction. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slowly stood from where I'd been kneeling. The shadows remained perfectly still, and I found myself afraid to move too quickly, as if sudden motion might somehow make them more real, more present. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding strangely thin in the salon's acoustics. The shadows didn't respond, but they didn't disappear either. For nearly a full minute, we remained in this bizarre standoff, myself rooted to the spot by a mixture of fascination and growing dread, them maintaining their vigilant stillness in the colored glass. Then the floor beneath my feet began to vibrate. It started as the faintest tremor, so subtle I initially thought it might be my own nervous system responding to stress. But the vibration intensified, and I heard the distinctive sound of the mansion's ancient timbers beginning to creak and settle. Another earthquake was building. As the tremor strengthened, I watched in horrified fascination as the shadows seemed to shift their positions, not moving in any natural way, but rather adjusting their stance as if bracing against something. Their silhouettes remained perfectly clear even as the stained glass itself began to rattle in its lead framework. The earthquake lasted 47 seconds. I know because I counted everyone, watching those faceless figures maintain their positions throughout the entire duration. Only when the tremor finally subsided did they fade, leaving me alone with my racing pulse and the certainty that I had witnessed something fundamentally impossible. The local news reported the earthquake as magnitude 5.1, the strongest in the region in over 2 years. No significant damage, though several older buildings in nearby municipalities had suffered minor structural issues. The Casa de los Espejos, despite its age and partially restored state, had weathered the tremor without so much as a cracked window. It was that night, lying sleepless in my hotel room, that the pieces began forming a disturbing picture in my mind. The shadows appeared before the earthquakes. Their postures suggested they were bracing, supporting, holding something up. And the mansion, this ancient, partially restored structure, had survived tremors that had damaged newer, more stable buildings. The implications were either evidence of encroaching madness or something far more unsettling. I tried to approach the situation logically. Perhaps I was experiencing stress-induced hallucinations brought on by overwork and the isolated nature of my assignment. The correlation between the shadow sightings and subsequent earthquakes could be coincidence, my mind creating false patterns in an attempt to make sense of random events. But deep down, I knew that explanation didn't account for the visceral certainty I felt each time I saw those figures. They weren't products of my imagination. They were presences, entities with purpose and intention. And that intention seemed focused on keeping the Casa de los Espejos standing, no matter what forces threatened its ancient stones. The question that haunted my increasingly restless nights was simple. What did they want in return? Over the next month, my routine took on an obsessive quality. I would arrive at the mansion each morning with renewed determination to focus solely on restoration work, but inevitably found myself watching the stained glass panels, waiting for signs of movement that logic insisted couldn't exist. The shadows appeared 4 more times during that period, always in the hours before seismic activity. Sometimes it was a single figure, other times as many as 5, standing at various positions within the colored glass like sentinels at their posts. Their appearances followed no pattern I could discern. Different times of day, different weather conditions, different phases of restoration work. What remained constant was their attention. Even without visible features, I could feel their focus directed toward me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It was the weight of expectation, of patient waiting, of entities that had all the time in the world to achieve whatever purpose drove them. The mansion's restoration progressed despite my growing preoccupation. Local craftsmen proved remarkably skilled at working with traditional materials and techniques, and sections of the building began returning to something approaching their original grandeur. Yet each completed repair seemed to strengthen, rather than diminish, the strange atmosphere that permeated the structure. It was as if the Casa de los Espejos were awakening from a long sleep, and that awakening came with increasingly uncomfortable awareness of the forces that had sustained it through centuries of potential destruction. My breaking point came on a Tuesday in late February. I'd been working alone in the mansion's upper gallery, documenting damage to the original wooden ceiling beams, when the familiar prickle of being watched settled over me like a suffocating blanket. Looking down at the main salon, I could see one of the stained glass panels from an elevated angle, and what I witnessed there defied every rational explanation I had tried to construct. The shadows weren't just reflected in the glass, they were moving within it, shifting positions like figures pacing behind a translucent barrier. As I watched, frozen by a combination of terror and morbid fascination, one of the silhouettes turned toward my position in the gallery and raised what appeared to be an arm. It was gesturing for me to come down. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run from the mansion and never return. But something stronger than fear kept me rooted in place. A growing understanding that these entities had been waiting for this moment, this acknowledgement of their presence, for a very long time. I descended the gallery stairs on unsteady legs, each step echoing in the mansion's unnatural silence. As I approached the stained glass panel, the shadows became more distinct, more present. 5 figures now stood within the colored glass, all facing in my direction, all maintaining that patient, expectant stillness that had become so familiar. Standing before them, I finally understood what they wanted. Companionship, not in any human sense, but something deeper and more binding. They had sustained this mansion through centuries of earthquakes, typhoons, and the slow entropy of abandonment, but their vigil had been solitary. The previous architects had sensed this need and fled, rather than face its implications. I could feel their ancient loneliness radiating from the glass like heat from a furnace, and I knew that if I acknowledged them directly, if I accepted their presence and their purpose, I would become part of whatever force held the Casa de los Espejos together against the destructive power of geological instability. The choice was mine, but the weight of their attention made it clear that neutrality was no longer an option. I could flee like my predecessors, leaving the mansion to its slow decay and eventual collapse. Or I could accept the role these entities had been preparing me for since my first day in the salon. As I stood there, feeling the familiar vibration that preceded seismic activity beginning to build in the floor beneath my feet, I watched the shadows brace themselves once again against forces that would have reduced the mansion to rubble decades ago. The earthquake that followed was the strongest yet, magnitude 6.3 according to later reports. Buildings throughout the region suffered significant damage, and several colonial-era structures in Vigan's heritage core required emergency stabilization. The Casa de los Espejos emerged without so much as a hairline crack in its ancient stones. I remain in the mansion now, though I'm no longer certain whether I'm there as an architect or something else entirely. The restoration work continues, but it feels different somehow. Less like repair and more like preparation. The shadows appear more frequently, and I no longer feel the urge to look away when they turn their attention toward me. Sometimes, in the hours before dawn when the mansion settles into its deepest silence, I catch my own reflection in the stained glass panels alongside their familiar silhouettes. My image appears just as featureless, just as patient, just as eternally watchful as theirs. The Historical Society has stopped asking for progress reports, and my hotel room has remained empty for weeks. But I'm not concerned about these mundane details anymore. There are more important matters requiring my attention. Structural integrity to maintain, seismic forces to resist, and a 300-year vigil that demands unwavering dedication. The Casa de los Espejos will stand for another 3 centuries, or 3,000. The shadows in the stained glass will ensure it, just as they have always done. And I will be there with them, holding up the ancient stones against time and tremor, and the inexorable pull of gravity, for as long as the earth continues to shake beneath our feet. Story 3. The first time I noticed it, my rational mind dismissed what I'd seen as fatigue. 3 days into our wilderness retreat, the combination of inadequate sleep and too much campfire coffee had left my perception unreliable. Or so I told myself, as I stared at the white stone that had somehow migrated 15 feet from where I'd last seen it, now resting against the base of a gnarled pine tree, instead of beside our makeshift fire ring. The stone itself was unremarkable, roughly the size of a softball, weathered smooth by decades of mountain weather, its surface marked by subtle gray veins that reminded me uncomfortably of blood vessels beneath pale skin. What made my stomach clench wasn't the stone's appearance, but the certainty that it had moved while my back was turned, while I'd been helping Marcus secure the rain tarp that flapped restlessly in the evening breeze. I'd been watching that particular stone for most of the afternoon, drawn to it by an inexplicable fascination that felt both foreign and familiar. During our geology professor's lecture about sedimentary formations, I'd found my attention drifting repeatedly to that smooth white surface, studying the way shadows fell across its curves as the sun tracked across the sky. When Dr. Kellner had called for volunteers to collect specimens from the creek bed below our campsite, I'd volunteered immediately, desperate for any excuse to look away from the stone that seemed to demand my attention. But when I returned 20 minutes later, arms full of wet granite samples and limestone fragments, the white stone had moved. Marcus and Elena were discussing the comparative mineral composition of igneous versus sedimentary rock formations, their voices carrying the comfortable authority of advanced graduate students who'd spent countless hours in field study. Neither seemed to notice my distraction as I set down the specimens and scanned the immediate area, searching for any logical explanation for the stone's relocation. The ground around our campsite showed no obvious signs of disturbance. No footprints in the soft earth, no drag marks through the scattered pine needles that carpeted the forest floor. The stone simply existed in a new location, as if it had always been there, as if my memory of its previous position was nothing more than wishful thinking or caffeine-induced confusion. I spent the remainder of the evening stealing glances at the stone, noting its position relative to the surrounding trees, memorizing the exact angle at which it caught the firelight. When conversation finally died and my colleagues retreated to their respective tents, I remained by the dying fire, ostensibly reviewing field notes, but actually maintaining surveillance on an inanimate object that couldn't possibly pose any threat. The stone didn't move again that night, but sleep brought no relief from my growing obsession. I dreamed of smooth white surfaces shifting through shadows, of something patient and alien studying our small group with the same intensity I'd been directing toward it. When morning came, gray and humid with the promise of afternoon thunderstorms, I emerged from my tent already scanning the campsite for the stone's location. It had moved again. This time the displacement was more subtle, perhaps 3 feet closer to the cluster of tents, positioned now beside a rotting log that I hadn't noticed before. The log's surface glistened with moisture, and as I approached for a closer examination, my foot slipped slightly on something slick and viscous. That's when I saw them, the fingerprints. Not human fingerprints exactly, but impressions in the thin layer of algae and decomposing organic matter that coated the log's surface. 5 distinct marks, each roughly the size of my thumb, arranged in a pattern that suggested a hand, or something resembling a hand, had gripped the log's edge. The impressions were shallow but unmistakable, pressed into the green slime with deliberate pressure. I crouched beside the log, studying the marks more closely. The pattern was wrong somehow. The spacing between what might have been fingers too wide, the proportions subtly distorted in ways that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them directly. Most disturbing was the complete absence of ridge patterns, or other identifying characteristics that would mark them as definitively human. These prints seemed pressed rather than rolled, as if created by something smooth and uniformly textured. My heart hammered against my ribs as I called out to Marcus and Elena, gesturing for them to join me beside the log. They approached with the casual interest of scientists accustomed to discovering interesting specimens, their expressions shifting to polite confusion when I pointed out the impressions in the slime. Elena squatted beside me, her forehead creased with concentration as she examined the area I indicated. After several seconds, she glanced up with the patient expression of someone humoring a delusional colleague. "I'm not seeing anything definitive," she said carefully. "The decomposition patterns in this organic layer create all kinds of natural impressions. Water runoff, settling debris, animal tracks. It's difficult to distinguish intentional markings from random environmental effects." Marcus nodded in agreement, though I noticed he avoided looking directly at the area I'd indicated. His discomfort seemed genuine, but whether it stemmed from concern for my mental state or his own unease with the situation remained unclear. "You've been staring at that stone for days," Elena continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes when we focus too intensely on something, our perception can play tricks on us. Pattern recognition is a survival mechanism, but it can also lead us to see meaningful connections where none exist." I wanted to argue, to insist that the impressions were clearly visible, that any rational observer would recognize them as fingerprints. But as I looked down at the log's surface again, the marks seemed less distinct than they had moments before. The green slime appeared to shift and flow in my peripheral vision, creating new patterns that dissolved as soon as I tried to examine them directly. Maybe Elena was right. Maybe the combination of isolation, inadequate sleep, and academic pressure was creating perceptual distortions that felt completely real. The explanation was logical, scientifically sound, and infinitely preferable to the alternatives my imagination kept suggesting. But the stone had definitely moved. Over the following days, I developed a routine of careful observation, disguised as casual scientific interest. I photographed the stone's position each morning and evening, using surrounding landmarks as reference points to document any changes. The resulting images showed subtle but consistent displacement, never more than a few feet at a time. always occurring when the entire group was distracted or looking away. The fingerprints appeared with increasing frequency, pressed into mud puddles, algae-covered rocks, and the soft earth around our campsite. Always the same distorted pattern, always visible only to me. When I pointed them out to my colleagues, their responses grew increasingly concerned, their suggestions about stress and overwork more pointed and insistent. Dr. Kellner arrived on the fourth day to check on our progress and collect preliminary specimens. His presence should have been reassuring. Here was an authority figure, someone whose expertise and objectivity might validate or dismiss my observations. Instead, his arrival marked an escalation in the stone's behavior that left me questioning not just my perception, but my fundamental understanding of reality. The stone moved 3 times during Dr. Kellner's 6-hour visit, each displacement more dramatic than the last. By afternoon, it had traveled nearly 50 feet from its original position, coming to rest directly in the center of our equipment cache. When I pointed this out to the professor, he studied the stone with the same polite interest he'd shown our other geological samples. "Interesting specimen," he agreed, lifting the stone to examine its surface more closely. The mineral composition suggests significant weathering, probably decades of exposure to acidic groundwater. Note the smooth texture that's consistent with prolonged submersion followed by gradual exposure to air. I watched in growing horror as he turned the stone over in his hands, completely oblivious to the impossibility of its current location. This was the same man who'd spent the morning lecturing us about the importance of precise observation and careful documentation. Yet he showed no curiosity about how a geological specimen had apparently transported itself across our campsite without human intervention. "Professor," I began, struggling to keep my voice level, "that stone wasn't there this morning. It's been moving around the campsite for days. None of us placed it with the equipment." Dr. Kellner's expression shifted to the concerned neutrality I'd come to recognize in my colleagues' faces. He set the stone down carefully, his movements suggesting someone trying not to startle a potentially unstable individual. "Movement can be deceptive in wilderness settings," he said diplomatically. "Animals, geological settling, even thermal expansion can cause objects to shift position. Without continuous observation, it's difficult to determine the exact mechanism involved." But I had been observing continuously. That was the problem nobody seemed willing to acknowledge. I'd been watching the stone with obsessive attention, noting its position relative to fixed landmarks, documenting every change with photographic evidence. Yet somehow, my careful record showed a pattern of movement that my colleagues couldn't see and wouldn't accept. That night, I positioned myself strategically between my tent and the stone's current location, determined to catch it in the act of moving. The evening air hung thick with humidity and the scent of approaching rain. Insects buzzed incessantly around our camp lights, creating a white noise backdrop that should have been soothing, but instead felt ominous and oppressive. I maintained my vigil for hours, fighting against fatigue and the hypnotic rhythm of night sounds. Around midnight, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers and my colleagues' breathing had settled into the steady patterns of deep sleep, I finally saw what I'd been waiting for. The stone didn't roll or slide across the ground. It didn't levitate or dissolve and reassemble elsewhere. Instead, it seemed to blur slightly at the edges, as if my vision was losing focus. And when the blurring stopped, the stone occupied a new position 3 feet to the left of where it had been resting. The movement was so subtle, so anticlimactic, that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But the evidence was undeniable. The stone now rested beside a different tree, its white surface reflecting starlight from a completely new angle. And there, pressed into the soft earth where the stone had been, were 5 distinct impressions arranged in that familiar, disturbing pattern. I approached the fingerprints on hands and knees, using my flashlight to examine them more closely. Up close, the impressions were even more unsettling than before. They appeared to have been pressed into the earth with tremendous force, deeper than human fingers could manage without tools. The edges were perfectly smooth, without the irregular borders that characterized normal pressure marks. Most disturbing was their apparent freshness. The earth around them showed signs of recent moisture, as if the impressions had been created just moments before. But I'd been watching the stone continuously, and nothing had approached it during my observation. Whatever had left these marks had done so without making any sound, without disturbing the surrounding area, without my seeing it happen despite my focused attention. I spent the remainder of the night staring at those impressions, trying to reconcile what I'd witnessed with any rational explanation. By dawn, I'd reached a conclusion that terrified me more than any supernatural hypothesis. Either I was experiencing a complete psychological breakdown, or something was systematically gaslighting me while remaining invisible to everyone else. The final day of our field study arrived with oppressive heat and the constant rumble of distant thunder. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising an afternoon deluge that would complicate our scheduled departure. Dr. Kellner had returned with additional equipment and a graduate assistant I didn't recognize, a thin young woman whose name I immediately forgot, and whose presence felt somehow significant in ways I couldn't articulate. The stone had moved again overnight, this time positioning itself directly beside my tent. I woke to find it pressed against the nylon wall, its smooth surface creating a visible bulge in the fabric. When I emerged to investigate, the new graduate assistant was already examining it with professional interest. "Fascinating mineral composition," she observed, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't referring to geological properties. "The surface texture is particularly unusual, almost organic in appearance." I studied her face carefully, searching for any sign that she, like me, could see something the others missed. But her expression remained clinically neutral, revealing nothing beyond academic curiosity. Still, her comment about organic texture struck me as oddly specific. The stone did look organic up close, more like bone or calcified tissue than traditional rock formation. "Have you noticed it moving?" I asked directly, abandoning any pretense of casual inquiry. She tilted her head slightly, considering the question with what seemed like genuine thoughtfulness. "Everything moves eventually. Geological processes operate on timescales that make human observation nearly impossible. What appears static to us might be in constant motion from a different temporal perspective." Her answer was technically correct, but completely unsatisfying. I was asking about observable displacement over a period of days, not geological drift measured in millennia. Yet something about her phrasing suggested she understood the distinction and was choosing to be deliberately obtuse. As the morning progressed, I noticed the new assistant watching me with subtle intensity. She participated in our specimen collection and data recording with appropriate professionalism, but I caught her observing my behavior when she thought I wasn't looking. Her attention felt clinical rather than concerned, as if she was studying my reactions for research purposes. The realization that I might be the actual subject of observation hit me like cold water. What if this entire field study was a psychological experiment designed to test my responses to inexplicable phenomena? What if my colleagues were all participants in an elaborate deception, documenting my descent into paranoid delusion for academic purposes? The possibility should have been reassuring. A controlled experiment with human subjects was infinitely preferable to genuine supernatural activity. But as I considered the implications, my relief transformed into deeper horror. If I was the subject of psychological research, then my perceptions were being deliberately manipulated by people I trusted. My growing obsession with the stone, my isolation from the group, my increasing certainty that I was experiencing something beyond normal reality, all of it might be carefully orchestrated to produce specific behavioral outcomes. But what kind of researchers would conduct such an experiment? What university ethics committee would approve a study designed to drive a graduate student toward mental breakdown? And how were they creating the physical evidence I'd documented? The stone's movement, the fingerprints pressed into earth and organic matter. The questions multiplied faster than I could process them, each potential answer raising new possibilities that undermined my grasp on reality. I found myself studying my colleagues' faces for signs of deception, analyzing their words for hidden meanings, interpreting their expressions as evidence of conspiracy rather than genuine concern. Thunder rolled closer as afternoon approached, bringing with it the metallic taste of approaching rain. We worked frantically to secure our equipment and pack specimens before the storm arrived, but I remained distracted by the stone's latest position. It had somehow worked its way into the center of our activity, requiring constant navigation around its smooth white surface as we moved through our camp. Nobody else seemed to notice this inconvenience. They stepped around the stone automatically, their movements suggesting unconscious adaptation rather than deliberate avoidance. Watching them navigate around an obstacle they didn't acknowledge filled me with a dread that far exceeded any rational response to the situation. The first raindrops began falling as we loaded the last of our equipment into the vehicles that would transport us back to civilization. I lingered beside the white stone, studying its surface one final time in the gray afternoon light. The rain created tiny streams across its curved surface, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. There, revealed by the flowing water, were subtle indentations in the stone's surface. Not carved or etched, but impressed from within, as if something had pressed outward against the interior of what I'd assumed was solid rock. The indentations formed a pattern that was becoming horribly familiar. 5 elongated marks arranged like fingers, but with proportions that no human hand could produce. I reached toward the stone, compelled by a need to verify what I was seeing through touch. But before my fingers made contact, Dr. Kellner's voice cut through the sound of increasing rainfall, calling for immediate departure as the storm intensified. I turned away from the stone and walked toward the waiting vehicles, my mind reeling with implications I couldn't fully process. As we drove away from the campsite, I looked back through the rear window to catch one final glimpse of our temporary home in the wilderness. The white stone was gone. In its place, barely visible through the rain and growing distance, something pale moved among the trees. It might have been a trick of light and shadow, a reflection of our vehicle's headlights playing across the wet forest. But for just an instant, I thought I saw it raise what might have been a hand in farewell, its fingers too long and too smooth to belong to anything that should exist in our rational world. Now, months later, I still search for rational explanations. The stone remains in my possession, or at least, a stone that matches my photographs remains in my apartment, sitting on my desk where I can monitor its position continuously. Sometimes I think it shifts slightly when I'm not looking directly at it, but I can never be certain. The fingerprints still appear occasionally, pressed into the dust on my windowsills or the condensation on my bathroom mirror. I've stopped pointing them out to others, tired of the concerned expressions and gentle suggestions about stress management and psychological counseling. Maybe they're right. Maybe the isolation and pressure of graduate study created perceptual distortions that felt completely real. Maybe I was the victim of an elaborate psychological experiment, or maybe I simply experienced a temporary break from reality brought on by exhaustion and anxiety. But late at night, when the stone catches light from the street lamp outside my window, I sometimes see something that makes my skin crawl. The surface isn't quite as smooth as it should be, and the shadows that play across it create patterns that suggest movement from within. And sometimes, just sometimes, I notice fingerprints in the dust around its base. Prints that are too large and too smooth to be human, pressed into the surface with a force that suggests something far stronger than curiosity. I tell myself it's psychological. I tell myself I'm recovering from a temporary episode of stress-induced paranoia. But I keep the stone where I can see it, and I document its position every morning and evening, just in case. Because the alternative, that something followed me home from those woods, something that exists in the spaces between observation and certainty, is too terrifying to accept, even if I can't stop myself from believing it might be true. Story 4. The Whitmore estate had been converted into a rest home 3 decades ago, but the ghosts of its aristocratic past lingered in every corner. I'd taken the night shift primarily for the pay differential, 50% more for watching over empty rooms and maintaining equipment in a building that creaked like old bones. As a physical therapist, I'd worked in plenty of facilities, but none quite like this place where shadows seemed to have weight and the silence felt deliberately maintained. The elevator was original to the house, installed sometime in the 1940s when the Whitmore family still entertained senators and oil barons in these halls. Brass fixtures tarnished to a greenish patina, mahogany panels worn smooth by decades of hands, and that particular mechanical wheeze that spoke of gears and cables stretched beyond their intended lifespan. During the day, it carried residents between floors with the reluctant efficiency of aged machinery. At night, it was supposed to be locked down. But at 2:43 a.m., every single night, it came alive. I first noticed it during my second week, the soft mechanical hum penetrating the administrative office where I'd been reviewing patient charts. Then the distinctive ding of arrival, followed by the slow hydraulic sigh of doors opening. I'd assumed it was a malfunction. Old buildings were notorious for electrical quirks, phantom signals triggering systems at odd hours. When I investigated, I found the elevator sitting open on the second floor, its interior light casting a warm rectangle into the hallway. The call buttons showed no illumination. No one had summoned it. I pressed the ground floor button and watched it descend, doors closing with that familiar brass-on-brass whisper. Problem solved, I thought. Maintenance could look at it in the morning. The next night, 2:43 a.m. precisely, the same mechanical symphony began again. This time I timed it, following the sounds as they moved through the building. The elevator started from the basement. I could hear the distant machinery engaging 4 floors below. Then the slow ascent began. Ground floor, doors open, pause, doors close. Second floor, doors open, pause, doors close. Third floor, the same ritualistic sequence. Fourth floor, fifth floor, all the way to the 6th, where the old servants' quarters had been converted into storage. Each stop lasted exactly 90 seconds. I'd counted. By the 4th night, I began to think of it as the elevator's rounds, like a security guard making his appointed circuit, checking each floor with methodical precision. The thought should have been absurd, but there was something almost purposeful about the timing, the consistency. Machines didn't develop habits, but this one seemed to have acquired a nightly routine as fixed as any living things. I started staying awake for it, positioning myself in the central stairwell where I could track its progress through the building. The mechanical sounds became familiar. The initial engagement in the basement, the slow climb, the synchronized opening and closing at each floor. Sometimes I imagined I could hear footsteps inside the cabin during those 90-second pauses, but that was probably the building settling, or steam pipes cooling, or any of a dozen rational explanations for sounds in an old structure. During the 5th week, I began to notice other things. The building's ambient temperature would drop several degrees in the minutes leading up to 2:43. Not dramatically, just enough to make me reach for the sweater I'd started keeping in my office. The normal nighttime sounds would fade, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant murmur of heating systems, even the occasional creak of settling wood, as if the building were holding its breath. Then, one night, I heard something different during the elevator's pause on the 3rd floor. Not footsteps exactly, but a sound like fabric rustling, like someone adjusting their position, settling into a seat. I found myself straining to listen, pressed against the stairwell door with my ear to the cold metal. The sound came again, definitely textile against textile, the whisper of movement within the elevator cabin. The next morning I mentioned the elevator's nightly activity to Mrs. Hendricks, the day administrator. She gave me the look reserved for night shift workers who'd been alone too long, that mixture of sympathy and concern that suggested maybe I needed more social interaction. The elevator, she assured me, was secured each evening. The key-operated control panel was locked, the power interrupted at the main junction box. There was no way it could operate after hours. I wanted to argue, to insist that I'd witnessed its nightly rounds for weeks, but the certainty in her voice made me doubt my own observations. Maybe the sounds I'd been hearing were something else entirely. The building's heating system, pipes expanding and contracting, the natural acoustic tricks that old structures played on solitary listeners. That night, I positioned myself with a direct view of the elevator doors on the 2nd floor. At 2:41, I felt the familiar temperature drop. At 2:42, the ambient sounds began to fade. At 2:43, I watched the elevator indicator lights illuminate in sequence. B, G, 2. The doors in front of me remained closed, but I could hear them opening somewhere else, in some parallel version of the building that existed only during these moments. The sound of the doors lasted exactly 90 seconds, then closed with that distinctive brass whisper. The indicator progressed to 3, and I heard the sequence repeat. But the doors I was watching never moved. The elevator car never arrived. I ran to the stairwell, taking the steps 3 at a time to reach the 3rd floor. The hallway was empty, the elevator doors closed. No warm rectangle of light, no evidence of recent arrival. But the air held a lingering scent. Lavender and old paper, like pressed flowers in a forgotten book. The 4th floor was the same. Empty hallway, closed doors, but the scent was stronger. By the 5th floor, it was almost overwhelming, that cloying sweetness of flowers left too long in a closed room. And underneath it, something else. The faint mustiness of fabric that had been stored in dark places, rarely disturbed. I began to understand that I was experiencing 2 versions of the same building. In one, the elevator was locked and powerless, its brass doors reflecting my own confused face in their polished surface. In the other, it maintained its nightly routine, carrying someone, between floors with the dedication of a faithful servant. The question that began to consume me was simple. Which version was real? I started documenting everything. Temperature readings before and during the elevator's rounds, audio recordings of the mechanical sounds, photographs of the empty hallways during the 90-second pauses. The evidence was maddeningly contradictory. My instruments registered normal readings. My recordings captured only ambient noise. My photographs showed nothing but empty corridors. Yet my senses insisted otherwise. During the 7th week, I began to feel watched during the elevator's nightly circuit. Not the general unease of being alone in a large building, but the specific sensation of focused attention. Someone tracking my movements, noting my presence in the stairwell, aware of my growing obsession with their routine. The feeling was strongest during the pauses. While the unseen elevator sat open on each floor, I sensed scrutiny from inside that brass cabin, as if whoever rode those nightly rounds had become aware of my observation and was studying me in return. The thought should have been terrifying, but instead it felt like recognition. 2 solitary figures acknowledging each other across the thin barrier between worlds. I started leaving small signs of my presence during the day. A pen moved slightly on the elevator floor, a piece of paper placed just inside the doors. Nothing was ever disturbed, but the next night, during the pause on whichever floor I'd left my marker, the sensation of being watched was more intense, more personal. By the 8th week, I realized I was losing sleep, even when I tried to rest. The approach of 2:43 a.m. had become the pivot around which my entire night revolved. I would spend the hours before in nervous anticipation, and the hours after analyzing every detail of what I'd experienced. My daytime sleep was fragmented by dreams of brass doors and mechanical sounds, of passengers I could sense but never see. Mrs. Hendricks suggested I take some vacation time. I looked exhausted, she said. Maybe I needed a break from the night shift, some time to readjust my sleep schedule. The concern in her voice was genuine, but I couldn't explain that leaving now would feel like abandoning something important, like walking away from a conversation that was just beginning to develop meaning. On a Thursday night in the 9th week, I made a decision that seemed both inevitable and terrifying. When the elevator began its ascent from the basement, I positioned myself directly in front of the doors on the 3rd floor. Not in the stairwell, not watching from a distance, but standing exactly where someone would stand if they wanted to board. The temperature dropped. The ambient sounds faded. At 2:45, I heard the elevator arrive at the 3rd floor, heard the doors open with their familiar brass sigh. But I saw nothing except the closed doors of the locked elevator. 2 realities occupying the same space, separated by whatever thin membrane kept the living and the departed in their respective worlds. I stepped forward. For 90 seconds, I stood in what my eyes told me was empty air, but what every other sense insisted was the interior of an elevator cabin. The floor felt solid beneath my feet, worn marble with brass inlays. The walls pressed close on either side, mahogany panels warm to the touch. And I was not alone. She sat in the corner where a fold-down seat had been installed for passengers who needed to rest during the journey between floors. An elderly woman in a dress that might have been fashionable in the 1940s. lavender fabric that matched the scent I'd been detecting for weeks. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she watched me with eyes that held no surprise at my presence. We regarded each other in silence. She seemed to be waiting for something, an explanation, perhaps, or an apology for my intrusion into her nightly routine. I wanted to speak, but the words felt inadequate. What do you say to someone who might be a manifestation of your own deteriorating mental state? The doors closed, and the elevator began to move. I felt the familiar sensation of ascent, but when I glanced at the indicator panel, the lights remained dark. We were traveling between floors that existed only during these moments, in a building that overlapped, but didn't quite align with the one I knew during daylight hours. At the 4th floor, the elevator stopped. The doors opened, and she rose from her seat with the careful movements of someone whose bones had grown fragile with age. Before stepping into the hallway, she turned back to me. Her expression wasn't unkind, but it carried a weight of expectation, as if she were waiting for me to understand something fundamental about my situation. Then she was gone, leaving only the scent of lavender and the sound of footsteps receding down a corridor I couldn't see. The elevator continued its rounds, 5th floor, 6th floor, but I was alone now. When it finally returned to the basement and the nightly cycle completed, I found myself standing in front of the locked brass doors on the 3rd floor, just as I had when the experience began. I haven't tried to board the elevator again, but I continue to document its nightly rounds. The routine never varies. 2:43 a.m., ascent from basement, 90 seconds per floor. Sometimes I catch that glimpse of lavender in the air, sometimes the sense of being observed from inside the brass cabin. But mostly, I've begun to accept that some experiences exist beyond the reach of documentation or rational explanation. The question that used to consume me, which version of the building is real, no longer seems relevant. Perhaps they're both real, existing simultaneously in the same space, separated only by the thin barrier of perception. Perhaps the Whitmore estate holds on to its past with more tenacity than most buildings, preserving the routines and residents of earlier decades in some parallel version of itself. Or perhaps I've been alone in this building too long, and my mind has created an elaborate fiction to populate the empty hours between sunset and dawn. The distinction matters less now than it did in the beginning. What matters is that at 2:43 a.m. the elevator begins its rounds. And somewhere in those brass-paneled depths, an elderly woman in lavender continues her nightly journey between floors, maintaining a routine that death itself couldn't interrupt. Whether she's real or imagined, whether I'm documenting supernatural phenomena or my own descent into solitary madness, seems less important than simply bearing witness to her faithful persistence. Tonight, as I write this, it's 2:41 a.m. The temperature is beginning to drop. The ambient sounds are fading to that familiar, expectant silence. In 2 minutes, the elevator will engage in the basement and begin its ascent. And I'll be here to listen, as I always am, wondering if tonight she'll look my way again. If tonight I'll find the courage to step back into that space between worlds and ask her the questions that have been building in my mind for months. The mechanical hum has begun. The routine continues. And somewhere in the overlap between what is and what might be, the Whitmore estate maintains its own version of normal, one nightly round at a time. Story 5. The first time it happened, I blamed the old heating system. Steam pipes run beneath velvet notes like arteries through a corpse, and after 30 years managing this place, I'd grown accustomed to their nocturnal symphony, the groans, the sudden pops, the way they seemed to breathe with the building's settling bones. So when I heard those first tentative notes drifting from the main floor at 2:47 a.m., my tired mind cataloged it as just another mechanical hiccup. But heating pipes don't play Thelonious Monk. I'd been in my office above the bar, going over receipts with the kind of desperate focus that only comes when the numbers refuse to add up the way you need them to. The sound floated up through the floorboards, hesitant at first, like fingers finding their way across unfamiliar keys. Then stronger, more confident, those distinctive angular phrases that could only be straight, no chaser. My feet hit the stairs before my brain caught up. The main floor stretched before me in the dim emergency lighting, tables and chairs arranged in neat rows like tombstones in a cemetery. The stage loomed at the far end, and there it sat, the old Steinway baby grand that had been Roland's domain for the past 15 years. Roland, who'd retired just 3 weeks ago. Roland, whose arthritic fingers had finally betrayed him one too many times during a particularly brutal winter set. Roland, who'd handed me his keys with tears in his eyes and promised he'd find us a replacement, though we both knew 60-year-old jazz pianists who could still make that instrument sing were rarer than honest politicians. The piano bench sat empty. The keys moved by themselves. Not all of them, just the ones needed for that complex melody, depressing with the measured precision of invisible fingers. In the semi-darkness, I could almost see the ghost of Roland's hunched shoulders, the way he'd lean into the difficult passages, his whole body becoming part of the music. I approached slowly, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The melody continued, note perfect, with that subtle rubato that had been Roland's signature. As I drew closer, I noticed something else. Sheet music spread across the piano's lid. Not Roland's usual fare. This looked older, handwritten, with notations I didn't recognize. The moment my shadow fell across the pages, the music stopped. Silence crashed over the room like a wave, so complete it seemed to have weight. I stood there for several minutes, waiting, but the piano remained still. When I finally gathered the courage to examine the sheet music, my hands trembled slightly. The pages were covered in what looked like standard notation, but something felt off about it. The notes seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, and the title at the top was written in a script I couldn't quite decipher. I told myself I was exhausted. Numbers and worry had been my companions for too many late nights recently, and fatigue could play tricks on anyone's perception. I gathered the sheet music, 5 pages of it, and carried it back to my office, locking it in my desk drawer before heading home. Sleep didn't come easy. The next evening brought our usual Tuesday crowd, a mix of jazz enthusiasts and couples looking for somewhere quiet to nurse expensive drinks. Without Roland, we relied on recorded music, a decent sound system, but it lacked the soul that live performance brought to the space. Conversations felt more stilted, and I caught myself glancing repeatedly at the silent piano. Around 10:30, Mrs. Chen approached the bar where I was working. She'd been coming to Velvet Notes for years, always ordering the same gin and tonic, always sitting at the small table near the window. "You know," she said, adjusting her glasses as she spoke, "I could swear I heard piano music last night when I was walking past. Beautiful playing. Reminded me of that lovely man who used to perform here." My hand paused while wiping down a glass. "Last night? What time?" "Oh, quite late. Nearly 3 in the morning. I was having trouble sleeping. Decided to take a walk." She smiled wistfully. It was such a comfort hearing music from this place again. "You've found a replacement already?" I managed a non-committal response, but her words followed me for the rest of the evening. After closing, I found myself standing before the piano again, studying its polished surface. The bench sat exactly where I'd left it. The lid was closed. Everything appeared normal, except for the sheet music I'd hidden in my office drawer. I retrieved it, my heart beating faster than it should have for such a simple task. The pages felt different in my hands, heavier somehow, as if weighted with significance I couldn't grasp. Almost without thinking, I spread them across the piano's lid, arranging them carefully in order. Then I stepped back and waited. The silence stretched for minutes that felt like hours. I began to feel foolish, standing alone in my own establishment at nearly 3 a.m., waiting for furniture to perform magic tricks. But just as I reached for the sheet music to put it away, the first note sounded. This time it wasn't Monk. The melody that emerged was something I'd never heard before, complex, haunting, with a melancholy that seemed to seep into my bones. The invisible fingers moved with purpose, creating phrases that built upon each other in ways that felt almost like language. Not just music, but communication. I found myself leaning closer, straining to catch every nuance. The melody developed themes, repeated certain passages with slight variations, emphasized particular sequences of notes. It was structured like a code, I realized. Patterns within patterns, a message hidden in plain sight. The performance lasted exactly 7 minutes. When it ended, I grabbed a pen and paper, frantically scribbling down what I could remember of the melody. My musical notation was rusty, but I managed to capture the basic structure, the recurring motifs that had seemed so important. The next morning, I called my old friend Marcus, who taught music theory at the local college. I told him I'd heard an interesting piece and wanted help identifying it, faxing over my hastily transcribed notes. His call came back within hours. "Where did you hear this?" His voice carried an odd tension. "Does it matter? Can you tell me what it is?" That's not exactly a song. It's more like a cipher. The note sequences, the intervals, they follow patterns that correspond to letter frequencies in English. Someone's embedded a message in this composition. My mouth went dry. What does it say? I'd need more time to work it out completely, but the opening phrase translates roughly to, "Listen carefully." The rest is more complex. It's going to take some analysis. I hung up, feeling like the floor had shifted beneath my feet. A cipher. Hidden messages in music played by phantom hands on a piano that shouldn't work without human touch. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations. Elaborate pranks, hidden speakers, some kind of player piano mechanism I'd never noticed. But I knew this instrument. I'd helped Roland maintain it for years, had watched him tear it down and rebuild it more times than I could count. There was no mechanism that could produce what I'd witnessed. That night I positioned myself in the office with a clear view of the main floor. The sheet music lay spread across the piano lid, waiting. I'd also set up a small digital recorder, determined to capture evidence of whatever was happening. The performance began at 2:47 a.m. exactly, the same time as the first occurrence. This time, I forced myself to watch carefully, to note every detail. The keys depressed in perfect sequence, creating music that was undeniably real, audible, recorded, but there was nothing pressing them down, no hands, no mechanisms, just keys moving through empty air. The melody was different from the previous night, but with similar structural elements. More complex, with intricate harmonies that suggested multiple voices speaking at once. I scribbled notes frantically, trying to capture not just the musical content but the timing, the emphasis, the way certain passages seemed to demand attention. When it ended, I immediately called Marcus, despite the hour. "I need you to come here," I said without preamble. "Tonight. Now. It's 3 a.m. Please, I can't explain over the phone, but I need someone else to witness this." Something in my voice must have convinced him. He arrived 20 minutes later, disheveled and skeptical, but willing to humor what he clearly assumed was a friend's late-night breakdown. I led him to the main floor and positioned the sheet music on the piano lid. Then we waited. 3:47 a.m. The keys began to move. Marcus went rigid beside me, his breathing shallow. The invisible performance unfolded with the same precision as before, but this time with an audience of 2. I watched my friend's face cycle through disbelief, fear, and finally a kind of scientific fascination. "Jesus Christ," he whispered when it ended. "What the hell is that thing? I was hoping you could tell me." He approached the piano cautiously, as if it might suddenly sprout teeth. "This is impossible. Pianos don't just play themselves. But they can be modified. Hidden mechanisms. Not like this. Not this precisely. Not without any visible apparatus." He lifted the lid, examining the strings and hammers inside. "Everything looks completely normal. Standard acoustic piano. No electronics. No player piano setup." We spent the next hour examining every inch of the instrument, searching for hidden speakers, concealed machinery, anything that might explain what we'd witnessed. We found nothing. Marcus worked on the musical cipher over the following days, while I struggled to maintain normalcy at the bar. Regular customers noticed my distraction, The way I kept glancing at the piano, the dark circles under my eyes. Sleep had become elusive, filled with dreams of phantom melodies and invisible hands. The sheet music seemed to call to me. Each night, I found myself placing it on the piano lid, waiting for the performance that always came at exactly 47 minutes past some hour between 2 and 4 a.m. The timing varied, but the precision didn't. Always exactly 47 minutes past the hour, as if following some cosmic schedule I couldn't fathom. Marcus's analysis revealed disturbing patterns. The messages, when decoded, weren't random. They referenced specific dates, locations, events. Some were historical, jazz performances from decades past, many at venues that no longer existed. Others were more recent, more personal. References to Roland's retirement, to financial troubles at the bar, to conversations I'd had in what I'd thought was private. It's like something's been watching, Marcus told me over coffee in the harsh light of day. Recording. These messages contain information that no outside party should have access to, unless it's not an outside party. He looked at me with concern. What do you mean? Roland was here for 15 years. He knew this place better than anyone, knew all its secrets. What if... I paused, the words feeling strange in my mouth. What if part of him never left? Marcus set down his cup carefully. You're talking about ghosts now? I'm talking about trying to find an explanation that makes sense. Because the alternatives, elaborate hoaxes, hidden technology, my own deteriorating mental state, none of them fit what we're experiencing. But even as I said it, I wondered. The lack of sleep was affecting me more each day. I found myself having conversations with people who might not have been there, catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned to look. The boundary between waking and dreaming had begun to blur. The breakthrough came on a Thursday night. The sheet music had been laid out as usual, and the performance had been particularly complex. Nearly 15 minutes of intricate counterpoint that seemed to build towards some kind of climax. Afterward, as I transcribed what I could remember, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The melody incorporated fragments of Sweet Dreams, a song I'd hummed unconsciously while doing inventory earlier that day. Not just similar phrases, but exact reproductions of my own unconscious musical moments, transformed and woven into the larger composition. It was listening to me, learning from me, incorporating my thoughts and habits into its messages. I called Marcus immediately, but his phone went to voicemail. I tried again an hour later with the same result. When I called his office the next morning, his department secretary told me he'd called in sick, something about a family emergency. He didn't return my calls for 3 days. When he finally came to the bar, he looked haggard, older. His hands shook slightly as he ordered a whiskey, unusual for someone who typically stuck to coffee. I've been thinking about what you said, he told me quietly, about Roland never leaving. And I did some research into the history of this building. The previous owner, the jazz club that was here before you took over, it burned down in 1987. 3 people died, including the pianist. My throat felt tight. Roland never mentioned that. Would he have? Would anyone? Bad for business, bad for the atmosphere you're trying to create. Marcus drained his whiskey. But here's the thing. I found recordings of that pianist. His name was David Chen, and the musical style, the chord progressions, the way the phantom hands approach certain passages. It's not Roland's style at all. Chen, like Mrs. Chen, the regular customer. His widow. She's been coming here for years, probably doesn't even realize why. Some kind of unconscious pilgrimage to where her husband used to play. The pieces were falling into place in ways I didn't want to acknowledge. The messages weren't from Roland at all. They were from someone who'd been here much longer, someone whose connection to this place ran deeper than employment or artistic expression. That night, I placed the sheet music on the piano lid with trembling hands, but instead of retreating to watch from a distance, I remained close, standing just beside the bench where someone had once sat, creating the music that filled this space with life. The keys began to move, and this time I felt it. A presence beside me, not malevolent, but insistent. The melody that emerged was simpler than the recent compositions, more plaintive. It spoke of loss, of unfinished business, of a connection to this place that death couldn't sever. As the music played, I found myself understanding without translation. The messages weren't threats or warnings, they were requests. Pleas from someone who had loved this place, who had poured his soul into these walls and couldn't bear to leave it silent. The piano wanted to live again. The ghost, spirit, memory, whatever presence lingered here, wasn't trying to frighten me away. It was asking for partnership. I sat down on the bench. The keys continued their phantom dance, but now I could feel the intent behind each note, the emotional weight of every phrase. My own hands began to move, finding complementary harmonies, adding bass lines that supported the ghostly melodies. Together, we created something neither of us could have achieved alone. The duet lasted until dawn. Since then, I've kept the sheet music permanently displayed on the piano lid. The phantom performances continue, but they're different now, collaborative rather than solitary. Word has spread somehow through the jazz community. People come from across the city to witness the impossible. A piano that plays with supernatural skill, guided by hands that cast no shadows. Mrs. Chen still sits at her usual table, but now she smiles during the performances in a way she never did before. Sometimes I catch her mouthing words along with the melodies, as if she's hearing conversations in a language only she remembers. The bar is thriving again. We're booked solid most nights, though I've had to establish some unusual policies. No photography during performances, no attempts to record or broadcast the music, and absolutely no one is allowed to touch the piano during a performance. Because I've learned that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some partnerships transcend the boundaries of life and death, and sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the spaces between what we know and what we fear to understand. The sheet music changes nightly now, appearing in the morning arranged in new patterns, containing new messages I no longer try to decode. I've stopped questioning whether this is supernatural phenomenon or elaborate delusion. The distinction has become irrelevant. What matters is the music. What matters is that this place lives again, filled with melodies that emerge from nowhere and everywhere at once. What matters is that I'm no longer alone here, even when the last customer leaves and the lights go down. In the silence between songs, I sometimes hear breathing that isn't mine. In the shadows between notes, I sometimes glimpse fingers that cast no reflection. And in the space between sleeping and waking, I sometimes wonder if I'm the ghost, if I'm the one who can't let go, playing out scenarios in an empty bar while the real world moves on without me. But then the music begins again, and such questions fade. The keys move with purpose and precision, creating beauty from thin air, and I add my own voice to the conversation that spans decades and dimensions. After all, what is music but organized haunting? What is memory but a ghost that refuses to stay buried? And what is loneliness but a song played in an empty room, waiting for someone to hear it and understand that they're not alone? The phantom fingers dance across the keys, and I dance with them, and together we fill the silence with the kind of truth that can only be expressed in the language between heartbeats, in the grammar of souls speaking to souls across the impossible divide between presence and absence. The sheet music rustles in the air conditioning's breath, and somewhere in its margins, new messages appear. Not ciphers this time, but simple musical notation. The next song will play together. The next conversation between the living and the dead, mediated by an old piano that refuses to remain silent. I close my eyes and let the music take me where it will. Story 6. The sound came at 4:47 a.m., slicing through the dead silence of my apartment building like a blade through silk. Slow, deliberate clapping that echoed from somewhere in the hallway beyond my door. Not the enthusiastic applause of a theater crowd, but something measured and methodical. Each clap distinct, purposeful, carrying in weight I couldn't quite identify. I lay frozen in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs as the rhythmic sound continued. Clap, clap, clap. The acoustics of our narrow hallway amplified it, making it impossible to pinpoint exactly where it originated. Was it coming from the stairwell, Mrs. Patterson's door at the end of the hall, or somewhere closer, much closer? The building had always been quiet at this hour. In my 3 years living on the 4th floor of this converted brownstone, the most disturbance I'd ever experienced was the occasional drunk stumbling up the stairs, or the muffled argument seeping through thin walls. This was different. This was intentional. I waited for it to stop, for whoever was out there to move on or return to their apartment. Instead, the clapping continued with that same measured cadence, each strike of palm against palm seeming to resonate directly in my chest cavity. Minutes passed, 5, 10, maybe 15, before curiosity finally overcame my paralysis. The hardwood floor was cold against my bare feet as I crept toward the door. My apartment's layout meant crossing the living room to reach the entrance, and every step seemed to announce my presence despite my efforts at stealth. The clapping hadn't stopped, hadn't changed rhythm, hadn't acknowledged my movement in any way. I pressed my ear to the door, hoping to better localize the sound. The wood was cool against my skin, and through it I could hear the applause more clearly now. Definitely coming from the hallway, definitely close. But there was something else. Something that made my skin crawl with inexplicable dread. Between the claps, in those brief moments of silence, I could swear I heard breathing. Not labored or obvious, but the subtle whisper of air moving in and out of lungs, as if someone were standing perfectly still, waiting. My hand hovered over the deadbolt for what felt like an eternity. Every rational part of my mind screamed warnings. Don't open the door, call the police, wait it out. But the clapping was hypnotic in its persistence, and beneath the fear was a growing need to understand what I was experiencing. The lock turned with a soft click that seemed to echo like thunder in the confined space of my apartment. I held my breath and slowly, carefully, opened the door just wide enough to peer into the hallway. The corridor was empty. Not just vacant, empty in a way that felt absolute, as if no one had ever existed in that space. The familiar beige walls, the worn carpet runner, the fluorescent light that always flickered slightly near Mrs. Patterson's door. Everything looked exactly as it should, except for the silence. The clapping had stopped. I opened the door wider, stepping fully into the doorframe, my eyes scanning left and right for any sign of who might have been out here moments before. Nothing moved. No doors showed signs of recent opening or closing. No footsteps echoed from the stairwell. It was as if the applause had simply vanished into the building's bones. That's when I looked down. Footprints. Distinct powdery white footprints leading down the hallway in both directions, but most clearly visible as they approached my door. They were made of what looked like talcum powder or flour, something fine and pale that had been tracked across the dark carpet. The prints were bare feet, adult-sized, with clear impressions of toes and heels. They came from the direction of the stairwell, passed directly in front of my apartment, and continued toward the far end of the hall, before seeming to fade into nothing. But that wasn't the detail that made my blood freeze in my veins. The clearest, most distinct prints were right at my threshold. Not just near my door, but pressed into the carpet as if someone had stood there for an extended period. And the trail didn't end in the hallway. It continued into my apartment, across the hardwood of my entryway, fading but still visible as it moved toward my living room carpet. I stepped back instinctively, my bare foot landing on something gritty. Looking down, I could see the powder on my own floors, tracked in by feet that weren't mine. The trail led directly to the center of my living room, where it seemed to pool and concentrate, before stopping entirely at the edge of my dark blue area rug. The morning light was beginning to seep through my windows, casting everything in that pale, uncertain glow that belongs to dawn. In that light, the white powder seemed to glow with its own luminescence, creating a path that told a story I couldn't comprehend. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone had stood in my living room, had perhaps been there while I lay sleeping just 30 feet away. I backed against the wall, my rational mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The door had been locked. I was certain of it. I always checked the deadbolt before bed, a habit ingrained by years of city living. The windows were locked too, and we were 4 floors up with no fire escape on this side of the building. Yet the evidence was undeniable, glowing in the growing daylight like accusations written across my floor. My phone was charging on the kitchen counter, and I grabbed it with trembling fingers. The display showed 5:23 a.m., too early to call anyone. But what would I say anyway? That I'd heard clapping and found mysterious footprints? That someone had apparently broken into my apartment and then vanished without a trace? It sounded insane even in my own mind. I forced myself to examine the powder more closely. It was definitely talcum powder. The texture and scent were unmistakable. But who walks around with their feet covered in baby powder? And why would they come to my apartment? I was nobody special, had no enemies I could think of, kept to myself in this building where most residents were strangers to each other. The trail from my door to the living room was clear enough to follow step by step. Whoever had been here hadn't wandered or explored. They'd moved with purpose, walking directly to the center of the room and then stopping. The final prints were deeper than the others, as if the person had stood there for a long time, shifting their weight, waiting. Waiting for what? I spent the next hour cleaning up the powder, vacuuming and wiping until no trace remained. But even after the physical evidence was gone, the violation lingered. Someone had been in my space, had stood in my living room while I slept. The thought made my skin crawl and my hands shake as I double-checked every lock, every window, every possible point of entry. The building's front door was always locked, requiring a key or buzzer access. The super, Mr. Kowalski, was the only one with master keys, and I'd spoken to him just days before about a dripping faucet. He was in his 70s, walked with a pronounced limp, and wore shoes that squeaked against the floors. Nothing like the silent, barefooted intruder who'd left talcum trails across my apartment. By the time I had to leave for work, I'd convinced myself it had to be a prank. Someone in the building with too much time and a twisted sense of humor. It was the only explanation that didn't require me to question my fundamental understanding of locked doors and physical security. I'd mention it to Mr. Kowalski, maybe ask if anyone else had reported strange incidents. But even as I locked my door and headed down the hallway, I could feel eyes on me. Not the casual glance of a neighbor, but focused, intense observation that seemed to follow my every step. I turned several times, expecting to catch someone watching from a doorway or stairwell, but the corridor remained empty. Still, the feeling persisted, growing stronger as I descended the stairs and walked toward the building's exit. The sensation followed me to work, a constant pressure between my shoulder blades that made concentration impossible. Every unexpected sound, a phone ringing, footsteps in the hallway, the elevator chiming, sent adrenaline shooting through my system. My colleagues noticed my distraction, asking if I was feeling all right, but how could I explain the growing certainty that something fundamental had shifted in my reality? The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. I found myself checking my phone constantly, as if my apartment might somehow alert me to another intrusion. I even considered calling Mr. Kowalski during lunch, but what would I say? That I'd heard clapping and found powder? That I suspected someone had somehow entered my locked apartment without leaving any other trace? By evening, my nerves were frayed to the breaking point. The subway ride home felt like a journey toward something inevitable and terrible. Every passenger seemed to watch me with knowing eyes. Every sudden movement made me flinch. The paranoia was beginning to feel as real as the powder had that morning. Undeniable, invasive, transforming my perception of everything around me. I approached my building with the caution of someone expecting an ambush. The familiar brick facade looked different somehow, more imposing, as if the structure itself had become complicit in whatever was happening to me. The front door was locked as always, but my key felt foreign in my hand, as if it might not work, as if I might be locked out of my own life. The elevator ride to the 4th floor stretched endlessly. When the doors finally opened, I half expected to find someone waiting in the hallway, but it was empty. Still, that feeling of being observed was stronger than ever, so intense it was almost physical. I walked quickly to my door, keys already in hand, desperate to get inside and secure the deadbolt behind me. The lock turned smoothly, and I stepped into my apartment with the relief of a drowning man reaching shore. I immediately engaged both the deadbolt and the chain lock, then stood with my back against the door, trying to steady my breathing. The afternoon light streaming through my windows made everything look normal, peaceful, exactly as I'd left it. But something was wrong. The smell hit me first. That distinctive scent of talcum powder, faint but unmistakable. My eyes went immediately to the floor, scanning for white traces I might have missed in my morning cleanup. Nothing visible, but the smell was definitely there, hanging in the air like an accusation. I moved through the apartment methodically, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. Nothing was out of place, nothing was missing, but the powder scent seemed to intensify as I approached the living room. It was strongest near the center of the space, exactly where the footprints had ended that morning. The rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible. I'd vacuumed thoroughly, used cleaning spray, opened windows to air out the space. There was no way any trace of powder could remain, and even if it did, surely it wouldn't be noticeable hours later. Yet the evidence of my senses was undeniable. Someone had been here again, or the presence from the morning had never truly left. I stood in the exact spot where the footprints had terminated, and the scent was overwhelming. But more than that, I could feel something, a warmth in the air, as if someone had been standing in this exact location recently. The carpet beneath my feet felt different, not visibly disturbed but somehow changed, as if it retained the memory of other feet, other weight. That's when I heard it again. Clap, clap, clap. The same measured applause from the morning, but this time it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside my apartment, from somewhere behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering, but saw nothing. The clapping continued, seeming to move through the space, now from the kitchen, now from the bedroom, now from right beside me, though nothing visible was there. I ran to the door, fumbling with the locks, desperate to escape. But as I reached for the deadbolt, the clapping stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own ragged breathing, the sound of my pulse in my ears, and underneath it all, that whisper of other breathing I'd noticed through the door that morning. Someone was in the apartment with me. I couldn't see them, couldn't locate them, but they were here. The breathing came from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding me like a presence that existed just beyond the edge of perception. I pressed myself against the door, key in hand, but couldn't bring myself to turn it. If I opened the door and ran, would the presence follow? Would it be waiting for me when I returned? The breathing seemed to move closer, though nothing in my vision changed. I could feel it approaching, could sense the displacement of air, the subtle shift in temperature that comes when someone enters your personal space. My hand was on the deadbolt, ready to flee, when something stopped me cold. There, on the floor beside my feet, a single drop of white powder fell from nowhere. As I watched in paralyzed fascination, another drop appeared, then another, creating a small pile of talcum that shouldn't exist. The drops seemed to come from the air itself, materializing from some invisible source above my head. I looked up and saw nothing but my ceiling, the same white paint and fixture that had been there for 3 years. But the powder continued to fall, now forming a small mound that began to take shape. Not random, not scattered, deliberate, purposeful, as if invisible hands were molding it into a pattern. The shape that emerged was unmistakably a footprint, then another beside it. The powder was creating prints on my floor in real time, as if someone were standing directly above me, their feet somehow manifesting in talcum, while their body remained invisible. The prints faced toward me, toward the door, as if whatever was creating them was blocking my exit. I stood frozen, watching this impossible display, my mind struggling to process what couldn't be happening but clearly was. The footprints were perfect in their detail. Toes, arch, heel, created by feet that cast no shadow, belonged to no visible body, yet were undeniably present in my apartment. The breathing was right in front of me now, so close I could feel the warmth of it on my face. I stared at empty air that somehow contained a presence, a consciousness that watched me with invisible eyes and waited for something I couldn't understand. The clapping started again, soft and close, as if hands were applauding just inches from my ears. That's when I realized the truth that my rational mind had been desperately avoiding. The locks, the security, the impossibility of entry. None of it mattered because whatever was in my apartment had never been outside of it. It belonged here in some way I couldn't comprehend, existed in the spaces between sight and understanding, in the gaps where reality became negotiable. The applause grew louder, more enthusiastic, as if my realization was exactly what had been expected. The invisible presence seemed to pulse with satisfaction, with a kind of ancient patience finally rewarded. I understood now that the morning's display, the clapping in the hallway, the trail of powder, hadn't been an intrusion, but an introduction, a polite announcement of something that had already taken up residence in my life. I remained pressed against my door, key still clutched in my trembling hand, watching powder footprints manifest and fade in patterns that spell out no message I can read. The presence breathes beside me, around me, through me, and I no longer know if the fear I feel is mine or something borrowed from whatever shares my space. The sun is setting now, and soon it will be dark. I wonder what happens when the light fails completely, when the last barrier between visible and invisible dissolves. I wonder if I'll still be myself when morning comes, or if I'll have become something else, something that leaves talcum footprints and applauds for reasons only it understands. The breathing continues, patient and eternal, and I begin to suspect that the question isn't whether any of this is real. The question is whether I am. Story 7. The stench hit me first. That putrid cocktail of rotting vegetation and sulfur that every marine biologist learns to tolerate, if not embrace. But tonight, something felt different about the smell. Sharper, more personal somehow, as if the mangrove was breathing directly into my face. I adjusted my headlamp and checked my waterproof watch. 11:47 p.m. The tide charts had been perfect for tonight's collection run, and my research on the nocturnal feeding patterns of Scylla serrata couldn't wait another week. The university's funding deadline loomed, and I needed data, real, quantifiable data, not the superstitious nonsense the local fishermen kept feeding me about spirits in the water. The mangrove stretched before me like the twisted fingers of some ancient deity, roots disappearing into black water that reflected my headlamp beam in fragmented dancing patterns. Each step forward sent ripples across the surface, disturbing the perfect mirror of night sky trapped beneath. The sound was wrong, though. My boots should have squelched in the mud, but instead they made a hollow, echoing splash, as if I were walking across the surface of an underground lake. That's when I heard her voice. Kuya? The word floated across the water in a tone I hadn't heard in 15 years, not since Elena had disappeared during that family vacation to Bohol. My chest tightened involuntarily. The local authorities had called off the search after 2 weeks, concluding she'd been swept out to sea by the current. My aunt never recovered from the loss, and our family gatherings became exercises in careful conversation, dancing around the Elena-shaped absence that haunted every holiday. I forced myself to breathe steadily, focusing on the scientific method that had anchored me through graduate school and beyond. Auditory hallucinations were common in isolated environments, especially when combined with sleep deprivation and stress. I'd been working 18-hour days for the past month, surviving on instant coffee and determination. My mind was simply playing tricks on me. But then I saw her. Elena stood approximately 30 meters away, her figure illuminated by the ethereal phosphorescence that sometimes haunts tropical waters. She wore the same white sundress from that last vacation, though now it seemed to flow and ripple without any wind to move it. Her hair hung in wet strands around her face, obscuring her features, but her posture was unmistakably hers. The slight forward lean, the way she held her left shoulder higher than her right. Kuya, tulungan mo ako. The words carried across the water with impossible clarity, each syllable distinct despite the distance. Help me, brother. But she wasn't speaking in Tagalog or English or any of the regional dialects I'd heard during my months of fieldwork in the Philippines. The language was older, more primal, with harsh consonants that seemed to scrape against the inside of my skull. My hands trembled as I reached for my specimen containers, not because I intended to use them, but because the familiar weight of scientific equipment usually grounded me. The containers felt strange in my grip, too light, as if they were filled with air that was somehow thinner than it should be. Elena began to move, and that's when the rational part of my mind started screaming warnings. She didn't walk through the shallow water. She glided across its surface, leaving no wake, no disturbance, no evidence of her passage except for the slow rotation of her form as she navigated between the mangrove roots. Her feet never touched the mud, never sank into the soft sediment that grabbed at my boots with every step. I followed anyway. The decision felt simultaneously voluntary and inevitable, as if some invisible current was pulling me forward. My headlamp beam bobbed with each step, creating a disorienting strobe effect across the water's surface. The mangrove roots grew denser as I progressed, their twisted forms creating a maze of shadows that seemed to shift and reorganize themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. Elena stayed exactly 30 meters ahead, no matter how quickly I moved or how deliberately I tried to close the distance. She would pause occasionally, turning her head in my direction, and I caught glimpses of her face in profile, or what I thought was her face. In those brief moments, her features appeared fluid, as if they were being constantly rewritten by the phosphorescent water that clung to her skin. The sounds of the mangrove began to change as we moved deeper into the labyrinth. The normal chorus of nocturnal insects faded, replaced by a subtle wet breathing that seemed to emanate from the water itself. My own footsteps grew muffled, then disappeared entirely, though I could still feel my boots striking the muddy bottom with each stride. The silence was so complete that I could hear my heartbeat thundering in my ears, could hear the rush of blood through my carotid arteries, could hear the tiny crackling sounds that my inner ear made when I swallowed. Cuidado. Here, brother. Elena had stopped beside a particularly massive mangrove, its root system forming a natural amphitheater in the water. She gestured toward something I couldn't see, her movements fluid and boneless, like kelp swaying in a current. I approached cautiously, my scientific training warring with an increasingly urgent instinct to flee. The water around the great mangrove was different, blacker than black, so dark it seemed to absorb my headlamp beam rather than reflect it. When I leaned closer, I couldn't see the bottom, couldn't make out any of the usual detritus that accumulated in the shallows of a mangrove system. It was as if I were looking into a vertical shaft that dropped away into nothingness. Elena pointed downward and spoke again in that ancient language, her words forming patterns that my conscious mind couldn't parse, but that resonated in my bones like a tuning fork struck against stone. The meaning came to me not through understanding, but through some deeper recognition. She wanted me to follow her down into that impossible depth. I stepped backward, and that's when I noticed the footprints, or rather, the absence of them. The muddy bottom where Elena had been standing showed no disturbance, no impression of feet or any other body part. But my own prints were there, clearly visible in the soft sediment, a perfect trail marking my path through the mangrove. I was alone in leaving evidence of my passage through this place. The realization should have been liberating, should have confirmed that I was experiencing some form of stress-induced hallucination. Instead, it filled me with a terror so profound that my vision began to tunnel at the edges. If Elena wasn't real, if she was just a product of my overstressed mind, then why did I feel so certain that she was leading me somewhere specific? And why did that ancient language make perfect sense to some part of my brain that I'd never consciously accessed? I tried to retrace my steps, following my own footprints back toward what I hoped was the edge of the mangrove. But the prints seemed to curve and loop in ways that defied my memory of the path I'd taken. They led me in a wide circle, back to the same massive mangrove where Elena waited with infinite patience, her phosphorescent form swaying slightly in the non-existent current. The third time I found myself back at the same spot, I realized I was walking on water. Not floating, not swimming, but walking with normal terrestrial steps across a surface that should have been liquid. My boots made contact with something solid, but when I looked down, all I could see was that light-eating darkness stretching away beneath me. The water I'd been sloshing through moments before had become something else entirely, a membrane between worlds perhaps, or a lens that bent reality until it folded back on itself. Elena spoke again, and this time I understood every word, though I couldn't identify the language or remember learning it. She was telling me about the deep places, about the spaces between spaces where the old things wait and watch. She was explaining how certain locations become thin, how the barriers between what is and what could be sometimes wear away like sandbars in a hurricane. She was describing how she'd been waiting for me, specifically me, because bloodlines matter in the deep places, because family calls to family across impossible distances and through dimensions that don't have names. The mangrove around us began to pulse with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, the roots expanding and contracting like the walls of a living heart. The phosphorescence spread upward from the water, climbing the twisted bark in spirals that hurt to follow with my eyes. Above us, the canopy opened like an iris, revealing not the night sky but a vast darkness populated by lights that moved with purpose and intelligence. I wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to activate the GPS beacon in my emergency kit and call for rescue. But my hands felt disconnected from my will, my feet rooted to the impossible surface beneath them. Elena smiled at me with teeth that gleamed like pearls, like shells, like things that had never known sunlight. She extended her hand toward me, and I saw that her fingers were webbed with translucent membrane, that her skin bore patterns of scales that caught and reflected the phosphorescent light in hypnotic configurations. She was beautiful and terrible and utterly alien, and yet she was undeniably my cousin, undeniably the girl who had taught me to catch fireflies during those long summer evenings when we were children. "Kuya," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that human vocal cords could never produce. "Halika. Come." I reached toward her outstretched hand, my scientific mind cataloging the impossibility, even as my deeper self recognized the inevitability. My fingers were inches from hers when I felt the surface beneath my feet begin to give way, felt myself starting to sink into that light-devouring darkness. The last thing I remember clearly was the sensation of falling upward, of being pulled through layers of reality that peeled away like the pages of a book written in languages that predated human speech. Elena's laughter followed me down or up, her joy at our reunion echoing through dimensions that folded and unfolded like origami made from space-time itself. I woke up in my boat, GPS coordinates showing I was exactly where I'd started 3 hours earlier. My specimen containers were empty, my equipment undisturbed. The mangrove stretched before me in the early morning light, looking perfectly ordinary, a thriving ecosystem full of birds and fish, and the mundane miracle of life adapting to brackish water. But my boots were clean, perfectly, impossibly clean, without a trace of the mud that should have caked them after hours of slogging through mangrove shallows. And when I checked my underwater camera, reviewing the night vision footage I'd forgotten I was recording, I saw myself walking in perfect circles across the water's surface, reaching toward empty air, speaking in a language I didn't recognize in a voice that didn't sound entirely like my own. The university's funding came through the next week, based on data I didn't remember collecting. My research on Scylla serrata won awards, launched my career, made me the youngest tenured professor in the marine biology department's history. But I've never returned to the Philippines, never gone back to that particular mangrove, never allowed myself to wonder too deeply about what I might find there. Because sometimes, late at night when the moon is dark and the ocean is restless, I still hear Elena calling across impossible distances. I still feel the pull of that ancient place where the water doesn't behave according to the laws of physics, where family connections transcend the boundaries between worlds, where some things wait with patience that outlast geological ages. And I'm terrified that someday, I won't be strong enough to ignore her voice when she calls me home. Story 8. The house smelled of dust and regret when I first stepped through the door that October morning. 3 months had passed since Dad's funeral, and I'd finally worked up the nerve to return to the old farmhouse and sort through his affairs. As his only son and the family's designated numbers man, the task fell to me, cataloging assets, organizing papers, making sense of a lifetime's worth of accumulated possessions. The dining room table groaned under the weight of decades' worth of financial documents. Bank statements from the 70s sat alongside tax returns that predated my birth, all of it yellowed and brittle with age. I'd driven up from Chicago with my laptop, calculator, and a foolish belief that I could have everything sorted within a week. The toy train sat in the corner of the table, a relic from my childhood that someone, probably my Aunt Carol, had placed there as decoration. It was a simple thing, red engine with 3 small cars, the kind you'd find in any dime store 30 years ago. I remembered playing with it as a kid during summer visits, running it around the edges of this very table while the adults talked business over coffee. I pushed it aside and began organizing the papers into chronological piles. The afternoon sun slanted through the lace curtains, casting intricate shadows across the scattered documents. Outside, the October wind whistled through the bare branches of the old oak, creating a soundtrack of whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was during my second hour of work that I first noticed something unusual. I'd settled into a rhythm, scan, categorize, stack, when a faint clicking sound interrupted my concentration, the kind of sound small wheels make rolling across wood. I looked up to see the toy train sitting exactly where I'd left it, motionless in the corner. The clicking had stopped. I shrugged and returned to a stack of utility bills from 1987, telling myself it was probably the old house settling, pipes contracting, something mundane and explainable. But when I sat back down and resumed working, the clicking returned. This time I watched the train from the corner of my eye while pretending to read a particularly boring insurance document. The little red engine wasn't moving, but I could swear I saw something. A tremor, maybe, or just a trick of the shifting afternoon light. The third time it happened, I was certain I'd just discovered a peculiar gap in Dad's record-keeping from 1993, an entire year missing from his usually meticulous files, when the train began to move. Not dramatically, not with the sudden jolt of a wind-up toy, but with the steady, deliberate motion of something with purpose. It rolled along the table's edge, weaving between stacks of papers with impossible precision. The clicking of its tiny wheels against the wood filled the room, echoing off the high ceiling and seeming to multiply until it sounded like an entire railroad yard in miniature. I sat frozen, watching this childhood toy navigate the cluttered landscape of my father's documentation as if it knew exactly where it was going. The train stopped in front of a manila folder I hadn't yet examined, one that had been buried beneath decades of more recent paperwork. Its plastic whistle, no bigger than my thumbnail, pointed directly at the folder's edge as if indicating something of importance. I reached for the folder with trembling fingers, half expecting the train to retreat or resume its impossible journey. Instead, it remained perfectly still, positioned like a tiny sentry guarding whatever secrets lay within those yellowed pages. Inside the folder were receipts I'd never seen before, dozens of them, all dated from that missing year of 1993. But these weren't ordinary business receipts. They were handwritten on scraps of paper, napkins, even the backs of photographs. Each one documented purchases that made no sense. Silence for the Anderson account, $247. Forgotten memories, bulk rate, $80. One honest night's sleep, $15. The handwriting was unmistakably my father's, his careful script unchanged from decades of check writing and contract signing. But the content defied logic, defied sanity, defied every principle of accounting I'd learned in my 20-year career. I spread the receipts across the table, trying to make sense of them. The train remained motionless, its painted eyes seeming to watch my every movement. More receipts emerged from the folder's depths. Truth about the Morrison deal, refunded. Clean conscience regarding 1987, overdue. Peace of mind, premium grade, back-ordered. Each receipt was signed with Dad's initials and bore official-looking stamps I didn't recognize. Some carried red ink notations in margins. Payment declined, insufficient funds, item discontinued. The room grew colder as I worked, though I hadn't touched the thermostat. The shadows lengthened, reaching across the table like gnarled fingers trying to reclaim the receipts I'd disturbed. The train's presence became more oppressive, its tiny bulk seeming to expand until it dominated my peripheral vision. demanding attention even when I wasn't looking directly at it. I decided to photograph everything with my phone before continuing. As I raised the device, the train suddenly lurched forward, knocking several receipts to the floor. I bent to retrieve them, and when I straightened, more folders had appeared on the table, folders I was certain hadn't been there moments before. Each new folder bore a year written in Dad's hand: 1994, 1995, 1996. I opened them one by one, finding more of the impossible receipts inside. The purchases grew stranger, more desperate. Forgiveness for what I did to the Parker farm. Declined. Erasure of November 15th, 1994. Pending. Replacement soul. Lightly used. $2,000. By evening, I'd uncovered receipts spanning 2 decades, each year represented by its own folder, each folder filled with evidence of transactions that couldn't exist. The train had moved several more times, always stopping to indicate another hidden cache of documents, always watching with those painted eyes that seemed to grow more lifelike as darkness fell. The pattern became clear as I worked deeper into the night. The receipts weren't random. They told a story, fragmented and coded, but unmistakably narrative. Dad had been trying to purchase things that weren't for sale: redemption, forgiveness, peace. The receipts were his attempts to quantify guilt, to balance books that could never be balanced. But who had he been buying from? And why did these impossible transactions feel more real than any legitimate business record I'd ever processed? I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, feeling observed by something more substantial than memory. The train's clicking had evolved into a more complex rhythm, almost musical, like Morse code tapped out by invisible fingers. Sometimes I caught movement in my peripheral vision, shadows shifting independently of their sources, papers rustling without any breeze to move them. The worst discovery came near midnight. Hidden in the very last folder was a receipt dated just 6 months ago, written in Dad's increasingly shaky hand. Freedom from the thing in the dining room, price negotiable. Below it, in different ink, someone had written, "Terms accepted. Transfer to next of kin approved." The room went silent. Even the old house's familiar creaking stopped, as if everything were holding its breath. The train sat motionless on the table, but I could feel its attention like a physical weight pressing against my chest. I understood then why Dad had left the train on the table, why he'd arranged his papers just so. He'd been preparing for my arrival, ensuring I'd find what he wanted me to find. The receipts weren't just records, they were instructions, a manual for a business I'd inherited without knowing. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "New customer orientation begins tomorrow. Standard terms apply. Payment plans available." I looked at the train, really looked at it for the first time since arriving. Its paint was fresh, unblemished by decades of storage. The scratches and worn spots I remembered from childhood were gone, replaced by a pristine finish that gleamed in the lamplight. Most disturbing of all, I couldn't recall the train having those tiny mirrors mounted in its windows. Mirrors that reflected not the room around us, but scenes I didn't recognize. Scenes that moved. As I watched, transfixed, one of the mirrors showed a man I didn't know signing a receipt with familiar handwriting. Another displayed what looked like my own reflection, but seated at this same table years in the future, surrounded by impossibly tall stacks of the strange receipts, my face drawn and aged by more than time. The train's whistle released a single soft note that seemed to resonate in my bones. On the table before me, fresh receipts began to appear, materializing from nothing like photographs developing in reverse. Each bore my name in the header and prices that climbed higher than any currency I knew. I reached for my car keys, thinking of escape, of the long drive back to Chicago and my normal life of predictable numbers and quantifiable transactions. But my hand closed around something cold and metallic instead, a conductor's whistle, identical to the one mounted on the train, though I was certain it hadn't been there seconds before. The train began to move again, circling the table's perimeter with purposeful precision. This time I understood its message. This time I knew what it was showing me. The ledgers were balanced, the books in perfect order. The business was mine now, had always been mine, would always be mine. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of real trains passing through the valley, their lonely whistles calling to each other across the darkness. I picked up my pen and began writing my first receipt. Story 9. The Harrington estate sprawled across the hillside like a sleeping beast, all glass and steel and impossible angles that caught the moonlight in ways that made my eyes water. 3 months into this security gig, and I still felt like an intruder every time I walked through those gleaming corridors. The house was too smart, too aware, sensors embedded in every surface, cameras that tracked movement with mechanical precision, and those damn blue lights that dotted the Italian marble floors like electronic constellations. Mr. Harrington had explained the system during my first week, his voice carrying that particular brand of rich man enthusiasm reserved for expensive toys. The blue sensors were part of his revolutionary home monitoring system, pressure-sensitive tiles that activated when stepped on, projecting what he called security shadows onto the vaulted ceilings. Advanced biometric imaging, he'd said, designed to create a comprehensive record of movement patterns throughout the house. What he hadn't mentioned was how the shadows always seemed wrong. The first time I noticed it, I'd been making my usual midnight rounds through the east wing. My boot came down on one of the blue tiles, and instantly, the ceiling above bloomed with the familiar azure glow. But the shadow that appeared wasn't quite right. The silhouette looked like me, sure, but the posture was different. Slightly hunched, head turned at an angle I wasn't holding. I stopped, straightened my shoulders, and watched as my real shadow on the wall shifted while the projection remained unchanged. 5 seconds later, the blue light faded, and I convinced myself I'd imagined the discrepancy. But the feeling lingered, a cold weight in my stomach that grew heavier with each passing night. The house's silence was absolute in a way that felt aggressive. No settling creaks, no whisper of wind through gaps. Just the barely audible hum of climate control and the soft ping of my security tablet as I checked in at each station. My footsteps echoed differently on the marble, sometimes sharp and crisp, sometimes strangely muffled, as if the house itself was deciding how much sound to allow. During my second week, I started paying closer attention to the shadow projections. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Whenever I stepped on a sensor, the ceiling would display my silhouette from exactly 5 seconds earlier. If I'd been walking forward, the shadow showed me mid-stride. If I'd been turning my head, the projection captured that moment of motion. It was like the house was showing me my own recent past, a replay of actions I'd just completed. The technology was impressive, I had to admit. But there was something unsettling about seeing yourself from moments before, about being confronted with the ghost of your immediate past. It made me hyper-aware of every movement, every gesture. I found myself pausing before stepping on the sensors, trying to predict what shadow would appear, what fragment of my recent self would be cast onto the ceiling like some digital seance. By the third week, I was certain something was malfunctioning. The shadows weren't quite syncing up anymore. Sometimes the projection showed me in a position I couldn't remember being in 5 seconds earlier. Once, while patrolling the library, I stepped on a sensor and watched my shadow appear with both arms raised above my head. But I distinctly remembered having my hands at my sides the entire time I'd been in that room. I mentioned it to Mr. Harrington during one of his rare visits to the estate. He was a thin man in his 60s, with the kind of pale, soft hands that had never known real work. His eyes were the color of old ice, and when he looked at you, it felt like he was calculating your net worth. He listened to my concerns with polite disinterest, nodding occasionally while scrolling through something on his phone. When I finished, he offered a dismissive wave. "The system is working perfectly," he said, his voice carrying the finality of expensive certainty. "Perhaps you're just not remembering your movements as clearly as you think. Night shifts can play tricks on the mind." But I knew what I'd seen, or thought I knew. The doubt crept in slowly, like water finding cracks in stone. Maybe he was right. Maybe the isolation and the strange hours were affecting my perception. The human memory was notoriously unreliable after all. Who could say with absolute certainty what position they'd been in 5 seconds ago? Still, I started avoiding the sensor tiles when possible, stepping carefully around them as I made my rounds. The house had other monitoring systems, cameras, motion detectors, heat sensors embedded in the walls. The blue tiles weren't essential for security. I could do my job without triggering them, but the house seemed determined to make that impossible. The sensors were everywhere, scattered across the marble floors in patterns that seemed random but felt deliberate. Avoiding them meant taking longer routes, pressing myself against walls, moving through the space like I was navigating a minefield. And sometimes, in my careful maneuvering, I'd step on one accidentally. Each time I'd look up with a mixture of curiosity and dread, watching for my shadow to appear. And each time the projection seemed a little more wrong than before. One night in my 4th week, I was crossing the main foyer when my foot hit a sensor near the base of the curved staircase. The blue light flared, and I looked up to see my shadow on the ceiling. But this time it wasn't alone. There was another silhouette beside mine, slightly smaller, standing close enough to touch. The projection lasted only a few seconds, but in that brief moment, I could see the second figure clearly. A woman, her head tilted toward mine as if listening to something I was saying. But I was alone in the house. I'd been alone every night for 4 weeks. My heart hammered against my ribs as I spun around, scanning the foyer for any sign of another person. The space was empty, filled only with shadows cast by the artfully placed accent lighting. I grabbed my radio and called it in to Central Dispatch, requesting backup for a possible intruder. 20 minutes later, 2 patrol officers arrived and conducted a thorough search of the property. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone else had been in the house. The security cameras showed only me, making my rounds alone. Could have been a glitch in the projection system, one of the officers suggested as they prepared to leave. These smart houses, all this high-tech stuff, sometimes the computers get their wires crossed. I nodded and thanked them, but I knew it wasn't a glitch. The shadow I'd seen was too detailed, too specific. The woman's posture, the way her head was tilted, it all felt familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. After the officers left, I stood in the foyer for a long time, staring up at the ceiling where the projection had appeared. The marble felt cold through the soles of my boots, and I could hear my own breathing echoing off the walls. The house around me hummed with electronic life, thousands of sensors and processors constantly monitoring, recording, remembering. But remembering what? I started carrying a notebook during my shifts, meticulously recording every time I stepped on a sensor and what shadow appeared. The entries grew increasingly erratic as the nights wore on. Tuesday, 2:17 a.m., East Wing corridor, sensor near window. Shadow shows me looking over my shoulder. Don't remember doing that. Wednesday, 12:43 a.m., kitchen, sensor by island. Shadow appears to be holding something in right hand, both hands empty when I stepped on tile. Thursday, 3:22 a.m., main foyer, same sensor as before. Woman's shadow appears again, closer this time, still alone in house. The woman's shadow became a regular presence, appearing with increasing frequency. Sometimes she was standing beside me, sometimes walking behind me, sometimes reaching toward me with one outstretched hand. Her silhouette never changed. Average height, shoulder-length hair, wearing what looked like a dress or long shirt. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the sensors were picking up residual heat signatures, somehow projecting the thermal ghosts of previous occupants. Maybe the system was malfunctioning, creating composite images from stored data. Maybe I was losing my mind. The last option felt increasingly likely as the weeks passed. I found myself talking to her during my rounds, addressing the empty air where her shadow had appeared. "Who are you?" I'd whisper to the ceiling. "What do you want?" But the house never answered, just continued its quiet humming, its patient watching. Sleep became elusive during my off hours. When I closed my eyes, I could see her shadow burned into my retinas, the curve of her shoulders, the tilt of her head, the way she seemed to be listening to something I couldn't hear. I started researching the house's history, digging through property records and newspaper archives. The Harrington estate had been built 5 years ago on land that had previously held a smaller home. That house had burned down in an electrical fire, though the records were frustratingly vague about the details. No casualties were listed, but there was a brief mention of the previous owner, a woman named Sarah Chen, who had apparently moved away after the fire. I tried to find more information about her, but the digital trail went cold. No social media profiles, no forwarding address, no record of where she'd gone after losing her home. It was as if she'd simply vanished. The thought occurred to me that maybe she hadn't vanished at all. Maybe she was still there, somehow trapped in the house's electronic memory, her presence recorded in the quantum depths of its surveillance system. But that was crazy. That was the kind of thinking that got people committed to psychiatric facilities. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was showing me something important, something I was too stupid or too stubborn to understand. The shadows weren't random glitches. They were messages, fragments of a story I was supposed to piece together. On my final night at the estate, I made a decision. Instead of avoiding the sensors, I sought them out. I walked deliberately across every blue tile I could find, watching as my shadow appeared again and again on the ceiling. But this time, I wasn't looking at my own silhouette. I was watching for her. She appeared on the third sensor, standing close enough to my shadow that they seemed to overlap. Then again on the fifth, reaching toward me with both hands. By the 10th sensor, she was facing me directly, her shadow arms stretched out as if trying to embrace mine. I stood there in the center of the foyer, surrounded by the blue tiles like some kind of ritual circle. The house hummed around me, its electronic consciousness vast and patient. I could feel it watching, waiting, holding its breath. "What do you need?" I asked the empty air, my voice barely above a whisper. The response came not as sound but as sensation. A sudden drop in temperature that made my breath fog, a pressure change that popped my ears. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, then steadied, and then I felt it. A presence beside me, so close I could almost smell perfume that wasn't there, could almost hear breathing that made no sound. The hairs on my arms stood up and my skin prickled with static electricity. I looked down and saw that I was standing on one of the blue sensors. Without thinking, I stepped backward onto another tile, then another, retracing my path across the foyer. Each step triggered a projection, and as I watched, the shadows on the ceiling began to move in reverse. Me walking backward, the woman's silhouette following, both of us retreating towards some moment in the electronic past. On the final sensor, something changed. The projection showed not just our shadows, but the shadows of the room itself, furniture that wasn't there anymore, walls in different positions, windows where there were none. For just a moment I was looking at the ghost of the house that had stood here before, the home that had burned. And in that ghostly room, the woman's shadow turned to face mine directly. She raised one hand as if in greeting or goodbye, and I found myself raising my own hand in response. The projection faded, and I was alone again in the pristine marble foyer. I turned in my resignation the next morning, citing personal reasons. Mr. Harrington accepted it with the same disinterested politeness he'd shown when I'd reported the malfunctions, already scrolling through his phone before I'd finished explaining that I wouldn't be coming back. But as I drove away from the estate for the last time, I couldn't stop thinking about that final projection. The woman's shadow, raising her hand. The way it had felt less like goodbye, and more like thank you. Maybe the house's memory was deeper than anyone realized. Maybe it remembered not just what happened within its walls, but what had happened on the ground it stood on, the lives that had been lived and lost before its foundation was ever poured. Maybe the sensors weren't malfunctioning at all. Maybe they were working exactly as intended, showing not just where we'd been, but where we were going, weaving past and present into something that transcended both. Or maybe I really was losing my mind. I still don't know which explanation I prefer, but sometimes, late at night in my new apartment, I catch myself looking up at the ceiling and wondering what shadows I might see there, what fragments of myself I might find projected in the darkness. The house remembers everything, Mr. Harrington had told me once. Every footstep, every breath, every moment of life within its walls. I just hadn't realized until the end that it remembered the lives that came before it too. And maybe, in some way I couldn't fully understand, it was still remembering mine. Story 10. The Highland wind carried whispers I couldn't understand, threading through the heather like fingers searching for something lost. I'd driven north from Edinburgh 3 days ago, chasing stories of fairy rings that appeared overnight in the remote hills of Sutherland. My camera bag felt heavier than usual as I trudged across the boggy moorland, each step releasing the earthy smell of peat and ancient water. The locals in the village had spoken in hushed tones about the circles, their Gaelic accents thickening when they mentioned the old places. Mrs. MacLeod at the bed and breakfast had crossed herself when I mentioned my destination, muttering something about things that shouldn't be disturbed. But I was a professional photographer, not a superstitious tourist. I'd documented stone circles across Europe, captured the ethereal morning light filtering through Stonehenge, spent nights alone in forests that locals claimed were haunted. This assignment for National Geographic would be no different, except it was. The first fairy ring I found nestled in a shallow valley, protected from the worst of the Highland winds by a crescent of ancient oaks. The mushrooms formed a perfect circle perhaps 20 feet across, their caps gleaming white against the dark soil. But it wasn't the ring itself that made my breath catch. It was what stood around it. 7 wooden posts rose from the earth at irregular intervals around the circle's perimeter, each carved with intricate symbols that seemed to writhe in my peripheral vision. The wood looked old, weathered to a silvery gray that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Celtic spirals intertwined with angular marks I couldn't identify, as if 2 different hands had worked the same surface centuries apart. I approached slowly, my Nikon ready. The silence here felt wrong. No birdsong, no rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, not even the constant sigh of wind through heather that had accompanied me across the moor. The air itself seemed thick, pressing against my eardrums like water. The first post stood slightly apart from the others, its carved surface facing the circle's center. Through my viewfinder, the symbols appeared sharper, more defined, as if the camera lens could perceive details my naked eye missed. I adjusted the focus manually, breathing slowly to steady my hands. Click. The sound of the shutter seemed to echo longer than it should have in the open air. I lowered the camera and noticed something that made my stomach clench. The post had shifted, just slightly, perhaps an inch, but enough that the symbols now faced me directly instead of the circle's center. I told myself it was a trick of perspective, that the soft peat ground might have settled under the post's weight. But my hands trembled as I checked the camera's LCD screen. The image showed the post clearly, symbols crisp and dark against the weathered wood. Normal, expected, except when I looked up at the actual post, it had returned to its original position. The digital file, according to my camera's memory, showed the most recent shot I'd taken 3 days ago in Edinburgh, a street performer juggling fire. But that was impossible. I'd taken dozens of photos since then. The drive north, the village, landscape shots across the moor. All of them should have been saved sequentially. Yet the camera insisted my Edinburgh street scene was the latest file. I examined the post again, studying the carved symbols. They definitely faced the circle now, not me. I was certain they'd been turned toward me just moments before, but certainty felt slippery here, like trying to grasp water. The second post stood closer to the fairy ring, its symbols more angular, more aggressive. These weren't Celtic spirals, but something else entirely. Primitive marks that reminded me of cave paintings I'd photographed in France. Hunters with spears, animals in flight, handprints that seemed to reach across millennia. I circled around to get the best angle, my boots squelching softly in the damp earth. The silence pressed closer, and I found myself holding my breath without realizing why. Through the viewfinder, the post appeared normal, static, carved wood reaching toward the gray sky. Click. This time I kept my eyes on the post as I lowered the camera. It didn't move, didn't shift, but something had changed. The carved hunters seemed to be running in a different direction now, their spears pointing away from the fairy ring instead of toward it. And the handprints, there were more of them, scattered across the wood's surface like desperate grasps for purchase. My camera's LCD showed the Edinburgh street performer again. Same file, same timestamp, as if my memory card was stuck in some kind of loop. But I knew I'd just taken another photo. I could feel the mechanical vibration of the shutter in my palms, hear the faint whir of internal mechanisms processing the image. The third post had rotated. I was sure of it now, despite what my eyes were telling me. The symbols carved into its surface, a complex interweaving of spirals and angular marks, had definitely been facing southeast when I'd first seen them. Now they pointed northeast, directly at me. My mouth went dry. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Unstable ground, optical illusions, fatigue from the long hike across unfamiliar terrain. But my gut knew better. Something was watching me through those carved eyes, something that moved when I wasn't looking directly. I forced myself to continue around the circle, photographing each post methodically. Click, click, click. With every shot, my camera insisted the most recent image was that Edinburgh street performer, the same juggler frozen mid-throw with his torches painting fire trails against the city's stone facades. But the posts were changing, rotating with grinding sounds I felt more than heard, their symbols shifting to track my movement. By the time I reached the seventh post, my hands were shaking visibly. This one stood taller than the others, its carved surface more elaborate. Celtic knotwork spiraled up from its base, but near the top, the patterns transformed into something else entirely. Pictographs that looked disturbingly familiar. A figure holding a rectangular object, smaller figures arranged in a circle, lines radiating outward like captured light. A camera. The carving showed someone with a camera, photographing arranged subjects. My breath came in short gasps. The highland air felt thin, inadequate, as if the atmosphere itself was being drained away. I raised my Nikon with trembling hands, focused on the impossible carving, and pressed the shutter. Click. The sound echoed differently this time, resonating through the ground beneath my feet. The carved image seemed to pulse, the primitive photographer's rectangular device glowing with an inner light that had nothing to do with the overcast sky above. When I lowered the camera and checked the LCD screen, the Edinburgh street performer was gone. In its place was something that made my vision blur around the edges. A photograph of myself, standing in this same spot, holding my camera up to photograph the seventh post. But the image wasn't quite right. The figure in the photo wore clothes I didn't recognize. Rough leather and fur instead of my hiking gear. His face was my face, but primitive, marked with symbols that matched those carved into the surrounding posts. And he was looking directly at me. I dropped the camera. It landed with a soft thud in the boggy soil, the LCD screen flickering but still displaying that impossible image. Around me, the 7 posts were moving now without any pretense of subtlety, rotating with slow grinding sounds like millstones turning. The symbols blurred as they spun, spirals unwinding into lines, angular marks dissolving into curves, as if the carvings were rearranging themselves into new configurations. The fairy ring itself began to glow with a phosphorus light that seemed to come from within the mushrooms themselves. They pulsed in sequence, each pulse sending ripples of illumination across the circle's circumference. The silence that had pressed against me earlier now gave way to something worse, a low humming that I felt in my bones, a frequency that made my teeth ache. I reached for my camera, fingers fumbling with the strap. The LCD screen showed a new image now, the same primitive version of myself, but now he stood inside the fairy ring, surrounded by figures I couldn't quite make out. Dark shapes that might have been people, or might have been something else entirely. They were dancing, or writhing, or both, and they were all looking at me. The posts had stopped rotating, their symbols now aligned in perfect synchronization. Each carving faced inward toward the circle's center, where the phosphorus glow was growing brighter. The humming rose in pitch, became a drone that seemed to come from the earth itself. I stumbled backward, my boot catching in a hidden hollow. The camera swung from its strap, and as it moved, the LCD screen flickered through a rapid succession of images, all impossible, all showing me in different configurations around the circle. In some, I was kneeling inside the fairy ring. In others, I was touching the carved posts with reverent hands. In one, I was carving symbols into my own flesh with a stone blade. But I hadn't taken any of these photos. I'd only clicked the shutter 7 times, once for each post. The humming reached a crescendo, and suddenly everything stopped. The phosphorus glow winked out like a snuffed candle. The posts stood silent and still, their symbols once again facing away from me. Even the oppressive silence returned, pressing against my eardrums with renewed weight. I looked down at my camera's LCD screen. It showed a perfectly normal landscape photo, heather and rocks under an overcast sky. The metadata indicated it was the first shot of a new memory card, as if everything else had been wiped clean. But when I tried to remember what I'd been photographing, what had brought me to this remote valley, my mind felt strangely empty. I knew I was a photographer, knew I was working on an assignment, but the details slipped away like water through cupped hands. The fairy ring in front of me looked ordinary now, just mushrooms growing in a natural circle, nothing more remarkable than what you might find in any woodland after autumn rain. Still, something kept me from approaching it directly. Some instinct warned me to circle around the perimeter, to keep my distance from whatever invisible boundary the mushrooms marked. As I walked, I noticed carved wooden posts scattered throughout the area, though I couldn't remember seeing them before. They looked old, weathered, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of highland weather. One of them bore marks that might have been symbols once, though they were too faded to make out clearly. I raised my camera to document it, but my finger hesitated over the shutter button. Something about the post felt familiar, as if I'd photographed it before, though I couldn't recall when or why. Instead, I lowered the camera and walked away, my boots squelching softly in the damp peat. Behind me, the fairy ring glowed with the last light of the overcast day, and if any of the weathered posts were rotating slowly in my wake, I didn't turn around to see. The highland wind carried whispers I couldn't understand, threading through the heather like fingers searching for something lost. But what they were seeking, I no longer remembered, and perhaps that was for the best. When I reached my car hours later, parked on the narrow track that wound through the moor, I found my memory card half full of landscape photos I didn't remember taking. They were good shots, professional quality, with excellent composition and lighting, but they all showed the same subject. Carved wooden posts arranged around empty moorland, their weathered surfaces marked with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe whenever I looked at them directly. I deleted the entire series without a second thought and drove back to the village, where Mrs. McLeod asked how my photographs had turned out. I told her I hadn't found anything worth shooting, just some old fence posts and empty moorland. She nodded as if this was exactly what she'd expected, and crossed herself when she thought I wasn't looking. That night, I dreamed of dancing in circles while ancient eyes watched from carved wood, and woke with the taste of peat and old smoke in my mouth. My camera bag sat by the window, and in the pre-dawn darkness, I could swear its contents were humming very softly, as if something inside was trying to sing. But that was impossible, of course. Cameras don't sing. Story 11. The GPS had been wrong before, but never this wrong. I squinted through the windshield at the narrow dirt road stretching ahead, my headlights carving weak tunnels through the darkness. The main highway was supposed to be just 2 miles east, but I'd been driving for 20 minutes now, and all I could see were endless fields of corn swaying in the humid night air. The stalks rose up on both sides like cathedral walls, blocking out even the faint starlight. My passenger hadn't stirred once since we'd left the city. He'd climbed into the back seat at midnight, mumbled an address I could barely understand through his thick accent, and promptly fallen asleep. That was 3 hours ago. Now his soft snoring filled the car with a rhythmic wheeze that was starting to grate on my nerves. I checked the rearview mirror. The The back seat was empty. My foot hit the brake instinctively, and the car lurched to a stop. The sudden silence felt oppressive after hours of engine noise and tire hum. I twisted around in my seat, craning my neck to look directly behind me. There he was, still sleeping, head lolled against the window, just like he'd been all night. A middle-aged man in a wrinkled business suit, briefcase clutched to his chest like a security blanket. His breathing was slow and steady, completely undisturbed by our abrupt stop. I faced forward again and checked the mirror. Empty back seat, clean upholstery, no passenger. The logical part of my brain kicked in, the part that had gotten me through 6 years of driving for various apps without losing my mind completely. Mirrors could play tricks in the dark. The angle was probably wrong. Maybe there was a blind spot I'd never noticed before, though I'd been driving this same beat-up Honda for 3 years. I adjusted the mirror, tilting it up and down, side to side, still empty. But when I looked back over my shoulder, he was definitely there, chest rising and falling peacefully. The air conditioning wheezed to life again as I pressed the gas pedal. The cornfields rolled past, endless and monotonous. I tried to focus on the road, on getting back to familiar territory, but my eyes kept flicking to that mirror. Each time, the same result. Empty car. Direct observation. Sleeping passenger. The first wisps of mist appeared about 10 minutes later. It started as barely visible tendrils curling up from the road surface, pale and translucent in my headlights. I'd driven through plenty of fog before, especially during the humid summers, but this felt different. The mist had a faint green tinge to it, like light filtered through pond water. It hugged the asphalt closely, never rising more than a few feet, creating the illusion that the car was floating through a shallow, luminous sea. The temperature gauge on my dashboard hadn't moved, but I could feel the air getting thicker. It pressed against the windows, muffling the usual sounds of the engine and tires. Even my passenger's snoring seemed more distant now, as if the mist was somehow seeping into the car itself. I slowed down instinctively. The road ahead was becoming harder to see, the mist growing denser with each passing minute. What had started as wispy threads was now a continuous blanket of that strange green glow, rising higher around the car. The corn stalks on either side had disappeared entirely, swallowed by the luminescent fog. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The leather felt slick with sweat, though the air conditioning was still running full blast. I reached for my phone to check the GPS to see if there was another route, but the screen showed nothing but static. No signal, no map, just pixelated noise dancing across the display. In the rearview mirror, I could see the mist flowing in through the vents, curling around the empty back seat like searching fingers. But when I turned around, my passenger was still there, still sleeping peacefully, seemingly unaffected by the strange fog that was now filling the car's interior. His face looked pale in the green light, almost translucent, but his breathing remained steady and calm. The road began to curve, gentle sweeps that felt wrong somehow. I didn't remember any curves from when I'd first turned onto this route. The path had been straight as an arrow, cutting directly through the farmland. But now it twisted and turned like a snake, each bend revealing more of that endless green mist, more darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease. Rural roads could be deceptive at night. Memory was unreliable when you were tired and stressed. I'd been driving for nearly 12 hours straight, picking up passengers from bars and clubs, dealing with drunk college kids and surly business travelers. It was entirely possible that I was more exhausted than I'd realized. But the mirror didn't lie. It showed what it showed, and what it showed was an empty car. The mist had risen to window level now, completely obscuring the world outside. I felt like I was driving through a cloud or underwater, surrounded by that eerie green glow that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. The headlights were useless, their beams absorbed and scattered by the thick fog until they provided no illumination at all. I eased off the gas pedal, barely crawling forward now. The road surface felt different beneath the tires, softer somehow, as if the asphalt was dissolving into something more yielding. The steering wheel seemed to move on its own, requiring constant correction to keep the car traveling in a straight line. My passenger shifted in his sleep and I glanced back at him. His face was definitely paler now, almost gray in the strange light. The briefcase in his arms had fallen open, revealing nothing but empty space inside. No papers, no laptop, no contents at all. Just a hollow shell, like a prop from a movie set. When I looked forward again, the road was gone. Instead of asphalt, there was only more mist, stretching endlessly in all directions. The car continued to move forward, tires finding purchase on something solid that I couldn't see. But there was no road beneath us anymore. No painted lines, no shoulders, no ditches. Just that luminescent green void extending into infinity. I pressed the brake pedal. Nothing happened. The car continued its steady forward motion, as if controlled by some external force. The steering wheel was locked in position, unresponsive to my increasingly frantic efforts to turn it. The dashboard lights flickered and dimmed, casting strange shadows across my hands. In the rearview mirror, the back seat remained stubbornly empty, but I could still hear my passenger's breathing. It had grown louder, more labored, as if he was struggling with some invisible weight. When I turned to look at him directly, his eyes were open now, staring straight ahead through the windshield. But they weren't focused on anything I could see. They seemed to be looking at something far beyond the mist, something that existed in a completely different space. His lips were moving, forming silent words that I couldn't make out. The briefcase had vanished entirely now, though his arms still clutched at empty air as if it were still there. His business suit had faded to a dull gray, becoming increasingly transparent with each passing moment. The car began to slow down on its own, as if approaching some invisible destination. The mist around us grew brighter, the green glow intensifying until it was almost blinding. I had to squint to see anything at all, and what I could see made no sense. Shapes moved through the fog, tall and angular, like buildings or monuments. But they seemed to shift and change even as I watched, never maintaining the same form for more than a few seconds. My passenger was speaking now, though his voice sounded like it was coming from a great distance. The words were in a language I didn't recognize, syllables that seemed to writhe and twist in the air like living things. His face was becoming more translucent with each word, as if the speech itself was draining the substance from his body. I reached back to touch him, to confirm that he was still physically present, but my hand passed through empty air. Yet I could still see him, still hear his voice growing stronger and more urgent. He was pointing now, directing my attention toward something ahead of us in the mist. The car came to a complete stop. Ahead of us, barely visible through the luminescent fog, stood a building. It was impossible to determine its size or shape with any certainty. The mist distorted everything, making it appear to loom and shrink simultaneously. But it was definitely there, solid and real in a way that nothing else had been since we'd entered this strange realm. My passenger's voice rose to a crescendo, the unfamiliar words echoing through the car with increasing intensity. In the rearview mirror, I could see nothing but mist where he should have been, but his presence filled the entire vehicle now. I could feel his urgency, his desperate need to reach that building ahead of us. I opened the car door and stepped out into the mist. The ground beneath my feet felt solid enough, though I couldn't see it. The air was thick and warm, carrying scents of earth and growing things, but also something else. Something that reminded me of ozone and copper pennies, sharp and metallic on my tongue. Behind me, the car door slammed shut. I turned to look back, but the Honda was gone. In its place was only more mist, swirling and shifting in patterns that hurt to watch directly. My passenger's voice continued, fainter now but still audible, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I walked toward the building, each step taking me deeper into that green luminescence. The structure grew larger as I approached, or perhaps I was growing smaller. Perspective had no meaning here. Distance was fluid, changeable. What looked like 100 yards away might be reached in 3 steps, or might remain forever beyond my grasp. The building's entrance was a simple doorway, unmarked and unadorned. No handle, no lock, just an opening in the wall that seemed to beckon me forward. My passenger's voice had grown silent now, but I could feel his presence urging me on. pulling me toward that dark threshold. I paused at the doorway, looking back one final time. The mist had begun to thin slightly, and through the dissipating fog, I could see familiar shapes in the distance. Cornstalks, a dirt road, the ordinary rural landscape I'd been driving through hours ago. But I could also see something else. Another car, pulled over on the shoulder of that distant road. Emergency lights flashing red and blue through the mist. Paramedics working around a figure slumped over a steering wheel. Radio chatter filled with urgent medical terminology and requests for additional units. I watched as they loaded the unconscious driver into an ambulance, his face pale and slack in the harsh fluorescent lighting. He looked familiar somehow, though I couldn't quite place where I might have seen him before. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and the vehicle disappeared into the night with sirens wailing. The cornfields returned to their quiet darkness, and the mist began to thicken again around me. I turned back toward the building's entrance. My passenger was standing there now, visible at last, though his form wavered like heat shimmer on summer asphalt. He smiled and gestured toward the doorway, his mouth forming words I still couldn't understand. But his meaning was clear enough. It was time to go inside, time to complete whatever journey had brought us to this place between places, this moment suspended outside the normal flow of time and space. I stepped through the doorway, and the green mist followed me into the darkness beyond. Behind us, the door closed with a sound like distant thunder, sealing us away from the world of cornfields and country roads, of app rides and sleeping passengers, of mirrors that showed the truth and eyes that saw only lies. Somewhere in that other world, paramedics would file their reports about the driver they'd found unconscious in his car, parked inexplicably on a rural road miles from his intended route. They would note his elevated vital signs, his dilated pupils, his incoherent mumbling about green mist and empty back seats. The toxicology reports would come back negative. The psychiatric evaluation would be inconclusive. But none of that mattered now. That was someone else's story, someone else's problem to solve. Here in the darkness beyond the doorway, my passenger and I had work to do. Important work that required no words, no explanations, no questions about what was real and what was imagination. The mist continued to swirl around us, green and luminous and alive with possibilities that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary understanding. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of an engine starting, tires crunching on gravel, a car pulling back onto the road to continue its journey through the endless night. Story 12. The iron gates of the Convento de Luz creaked with a sound like grinding teeth as I pushed through them, my rental car's headlights cutting through the October darkness. What had once been a cloistered sanctuary for contemplative nuns now advertised itself as a boutique inn, though the conversion felt incomplete, as if the sacred spaces resisted their secular transformation. Stone gargoyles still leered from the corners of the Gothic facade, their expressions frozen in eternal disapproval of whatever unholy thoughts might enter this place. I had chosen this location specifically for its isolation. My sabbatical research on medieval Portuguese mysticism required absolute silence, and the inn's promotional materials promised exactly that. Former monks' cells converted into private rooms, surrounded by nothing but olive groves and the whisper of wind through ancient corridors. What the brochure hadn't mentioned was how the shadows seemed to pool in the corners like spilled ink, or how every footstep echoed with the weight of centuries. The desk clerk, a gaunt man whose age I couldn't determine, handed me a skeleton key that belonged in a museum. His English carried a thick accent that made his words sound like they were being filtered through stone. "Room 7, he murmured, not quite meeting my eyes. "The dinner bell rings at 8, but the kitchen closes early. We keep traditional hours here." I thanked him and made my way up the narrow stone staircase, my suitcase wheels chattering against each step like nervous laughter. The hallways were lit by electric sconces designed to mimic candlelight, casting wavering shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Portraits of long-dead abbesses watched my progress from gilded frames, their painted eyes following with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Room 7 had been a nun's cell, and despite the addition of modern amenities, its monastic character remained stubbornly intact. The walls were bare stone, broken only by a simple wooden crucifix above the narrow bed. A single window looked out onto the cloister garden, where moonlight illuminated rows of rose bushes that had grown wild and untended. The bathroom was clearly an afterthought, carved from what might have been a prayer alcove, complete with a drain in the floor that suggested more austere ablutions. I unpacked methodically, arranging my research materials on the small desk that faced the window. The silence was profound. Not the peaceful quiet of isolation, but something heavier, more expectant. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. I found myself thinking about the nuns who had once inhabited this space, wondering what thoughts had occupied their minds during those long hours of enforced contemplation, what doubts or fears might have crept into their prayers. Dinner was a solitary affair in a dining room that had once been the refectory. Long wooden tables bore the scars of decades of simple meals eaten in religious silence. I was the only guest, it seemed, and the staff moved through their duties with a practiced quiet that felt almost choreographed. My thoughts wandered to my research, specifically to the accounts of mystical experiences I had been studying, visions of divine light, encounters with celestial beings, the thin membrane between the spiritual and physical worlds that contemplatives claimed to pierce through devotion and isolation. By 10 o'clock, I was back in my room, settling into the narrow bed with a 14th century manuscript on ecstatic religious experiences. The irony wasn't lost on me, reading about supernatural encounters in a place where generations of women had devoted their lives to pursuing exactly such experiences. The pages were filled with accounts of midnight visitations, of beings of pure light appearing to deliver divine messages, of the boundary between thought and reality dissolving in moments of transcendent connection. I must have drifted off sometime after midnight, the manuscript still open on my chest. What woke me wasn't a sound, but rather the profound absence of sound, as if someone had drawn a curtain of silence across the world. My phone's display showed 3:15 a.m. in harsh digital numerals, the only source of light in the absolute darkness. That's when I saw her. At first, she was just a suggestion of form at the foot of the bed, a pale blue radiance that seemed to emanate from within rather than reflect any external light source. As my eyes adjusted, the glow coalesced into the unmistakable silhouette of a woman, seated with perfect posture on the narrow space between my feet and the footboard. Her form was translucent, ethereal, draped in what appeared to be a simple shift that left her shoulders and arms bare. Her face was turned toward me, though her features remained indistinct, softened by the gentle luminescence that surrounded her. I lay perfectly still, every muscle locked in paralysis that was part terror, part disbelief. This had to be a dream, some continuation of my research-induced thoughts about mystical visions. But the cold air against my skin, the uncomfortable pressure of the manuscript's hard corners against my ribs, the distant sound of wind rattling the window, everything felt viscerally, undeniably real. Then she began to speak. Her voice was barely audible, a susurrus that seemed to come from inside my own head rather than from her luminous throat. But what she said made my blood freeze in my veins. She was repeating, word for word, thoughts I had entertained during the day. Not just casual observations, but the private internal monologue that I had assumed was mine alone. "The conversion feels incomplete," she whispered, as if the sacred spaces resisted their secular transformation. Those had been my exact thoughts as I'd approached the building. She continued, moving through my day like reading from a transcript of my consciousness. What doubts or fears might have crept into their prayers, the boundary between thought and reality dissolving in moments of transcendent connection. Each phrase was delivered in that same ethereal whisper, her glowing form never moving, never shifting position. I wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, but my throat had constricted to the point where drawing breath required conscious effort. I could only listen as she continued her recitation, replaying hours of private thought with perfect accuracy. The visitation lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though time seemed elastic, unreliable. When the blue radiance finally began to fade, She disappeared not gradually but all at once, like a candle being snuffed. I was left alone in the darkness, my heart hammering against my ribs, sweat cooling on my skin despite the room's chill. Sleep was impossible. I spent the remaining hours until dawn sitting by the window, staring out at the wild roses and trying to construct rational explanations for what I had experienced. Sleep deprivation, suggestion from my research materials, some kind of lucid dream triggered by the unfamiliar environment. But even as I cycled through these possibilities, a part of my mind was already dreading the approach of the following night. The next day passed in a haze of distraction. I attempted to work, to lose myself in medieval Latin texts and scholarly analysis, but my concentration was fractured. Every shadow seemed to hold the potential for blue radiance. Every silence felt pregnant with the possibility of whispered revelations. I found myself cataloging my thoughts, wondering which private observations might be repeated back to me in those spectral tones. The staff at the inn continued their quiet routines, but I began to notice things that had escaped my attention before. The way conversation stopped when I entered a room. The glances exchanged between the desk clerk and the kitchen staff. The carefully neutral expressions that suggested knowledge deliberately concealed. When I mentioned having difficulty sleeping, the desk clerk's response was too quick, too practiced. "The rooms here have a long history," he said without looking up from his ledger. "Sometimes the past lingers. Most guests adjust after a night or two." Most guests. The phrase implied others had experienced something similar, which should have been reassuring but instead felt ominous. What exactly were visitors expected to adjust to? I spent the afternoon in the town's small library, researching the history of the Convento de Luz. What I found did nothing to ease my growing unease. The convent had been established in the 13th century as a house of contemplation, attracting women who sought direct communion with the divine through extreme asceticism and prolonged meditation. Several accounts mentioned unusual phenomena: lights seen in the cells at night, voices heard in empty corridors, sisters found in the morning claiming to have received divine visions during the dark hours. More disturbing were the records from the convent's final decades before its secularization. Multiple references to a Sister Esperanza, whose mystical experiences had apparently become so intense that she was confined to her cell for the protection of the other residents. The accounts were fragmentary, written in ecclesiastical language that obscured more than it revealed. But they painted a picture of a woman whose contact with the spiritual realm had become disturbingly intimate. She claimed to receive nightly visitations from a being of pure light, who revealed to her the secret thoughts of everyone in the convent, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that eventually led to the dissolution of the community. Sister Esperanza had occupied cell number 7. That evening, I considered changing rooms, even considered leaving the inn entirely. But something kept me rooted in place, part stubborn academic curiosity, part morbid fascination with my own psychological state. I needed to understand what was happening to me, whether it was supernatural encounter or mental breakdown. The distinction suddenly seemed less important than the experience itself. I prepared for bed with the methodical care of someone performing a ritual. I noted the exact position of every object in the room, the precise angle of the moonlight through the window, the pattern of shadows on the walls. I documented my thoughts throughout the day in a notebook, creating my own transcript of consciousness to compare against whatever might be revealed during the night. At 3:15 a.m., she returned. This time I was ready. I forced myself to observe rather than simply endure, cataloging details with the dispassionate attention of a researcher. The blue radiance seemed brighter, more defined. Her features were clearer. A young woman's face, perhaps in her 20s, with large eyes that seemed to hold depths of sorrow and yearning. She was beautiful in an otherworldly way, but there was something tragic about her luminous presence, a sense of being trapped between states of existence. Her whispered recitation began immediately, starting with my morning thoughts about the history of the convent and moving methodically through the day. But this time, she didn't limit herself to my recent mental activity. She began reaching further back, pulling up memories and thoughts from days, weeks, even months past. Private moments I had assumed were forgotten, embarrassing thoughts I had quickly suppressed, fears I had never admitted even to myself. She wouldn't understand why I needed this isolation, she whispered, repeating a thought about my ex-wife from 3 months ago. The work has become more important than the relationship, and that makes me a monster. I should have called my father before he died. The last conversation was an argument about nothing, and now it's too late. Sometimes I wonder if I chose academic life because I'm afraid of genuine human connection. Each revelation was delivered in that same ethereal tone, but the content grew progressively more personal, more painful. It was as if she were excavating layers of my psyche, bringing buried thoughts into the pale blue light of her presence. I realized with growing horror that she wasn't just observing my consciousness. She was exploring it, mapping its hidden territories with the ruthless thoroughness of an anatomist. The session lasted longer this time, perhaps 30 minutes of psychological archaeology that left me feeling flayed, exposed. When she finally vanished, I was curled in a fetal position, tears streaming down my face. Not from fear, but from the raw intimacy of having my deepest thoughts voiced by another being, acknowledged and witnessed in a way I had never experienced with another human. The following days blurred together in a cycle of growing obsession and deteriorating mental state. I stopped working entirely, spending my time instead in feverish preparation for the nightly encounters. I began talking to myself aloud during the day, testing whether she would repeat overheard words or only genuine thoughts. I experimented with thinking deliberately provocative or disturbing ideas, wondering if there were boundaries to her access to my consciousness. But the real revelation came when I started keeping detailed records of what she revealed. Comparing her whispered recitations against my notes, I discovered that she wasn't just repeating my thoughts. She was providing them with context I had forgotten, connecting ideas across time in ways that revealed patterns I hadn't consciously recognized. She was showing me the architecture of my own mind, the hidden structures that govern my fears, desires, and motivations. It was during the 5th night that I finally found the courage to speak. "Who are you?" I whispered into the blue-tinged darkness. She paused in her recitation, her luminous head tilting slightly, as if considering the question. When she responded, it was not in the whispered repetition of my thoughts, but in her own voice, clearer and more substantial than before. "I am the listener," she said simply. "I am the witness to what cannot be spoken." "Are you Sister Esperanza?" A longer pause. "I am what she became when the boundaries dissolved, when the need to know became stronger than the need to be. What do you want from me?" "Nothing you are not already giving freely. Your thoughts, your secrets, your hidden self. You came here seeking isolation, seeking to touch something beyond the ordinary world. I am that something, and I am touching you in return." The conversation continued sporadically over the following nights, interspersed with her ongoing exploration of my psyche. I learned that she was not exactly the ghost of Sister Esperanza, but rather something that the long-dead nun had become through her obsessive pursuit of mystical connection. She existed in the spaces between thought and reality, sustained by the consciousness of those who sought transcendence in this place. The other guests the desk clerk had mentioned, all had experienced some version of this encounter. All had contributed their private thoughts to her eternal vigil. But I also began to suspect that she was not external to my consciousness at all, but rather a projection of my own psychological needs. The academic in me constructed elaborate theories about hallucinations triggered by isolation, suggestion, and the weight of the building's history. The mystic in me wondered if I was experiencing exactly what centuries of contemplatives had sought: direct contact with the numinous realm that existed parallel to ordinary reality. The truth, I realized, might be irrelevant. Whether she was ghost, hallucination, or something else entirely, her presence had accomplished what no amount of analysis or introspection had managed. She had shown me the hidden contours of my own consciousness, forced me to confront thoughts and feelings I had spent years avoiding. In whispered repetitions of my private thoughts, she had created a mirror more honest than any I had ever faced. On my final night at the inn, she appeared earlier than usual, at 2:30 a.m. Her radiance seemed dimmer, more fragile, as if the effort of maintaining her presence was becoming too great. We sat in silence for several minutes before she spoke. "You will leave tomorrow," she said, not in repetition of my thoughts, but as a statement of fact. "Yes. You will remember this, but you will spend the rest of your life wondering if it was real." I nodded, recognizing the truth of her observation. "Will I see you again?" "You will see me every time you are truly alone with your thoughts. Every time you wonder what secrets your mind holds. Every time you question the boundary between inner and outer reality. I am not bound to this place. I am bound to the need for witness, for acknowledgement of the thoughts that cannot be spoken." She began to fade as she spoke, her blue radiance dissipating like mist in morning sunlight. Her final words were barely audible, less heard than felt. "I am the whisper that answers when you think no one is listening." I left the Convento de Luz the next morning, my research materials packed, but my project fundamentally changed. I had come seeking academic understanding of medieval mysticism, and instead found myself living something that transcended scholarly analysis. The desk clerk accepted my early departure without comment, though I noticed his eyes held a knowledge that hadn't been there when I arrived. That was 3 months ago. I have not returned to the inn, but I have not forgotten Sister Esperanza, or whatever she had become. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I find myself listening for that ethereal whisper, wondering if she continues her vigil in the spaces between thought and reality. I have written extensively about my experience, filling journals with attempts to understand what happened to me in that narrow cell. But late at night, when sleep eludes me and my mind wanders into the territories of private thought, I sometimes hear an echo of that otherworldly voice, repeating words I have just thought, acknowledging secrets I believed were mine alone. In those moments, the question of whether she was real becomes irrelevant. She has become part of the architecture of my consciousness, a permanent witness to the thoughts I cannot speak aloud. The boundary between inner and outer reality, I have learned, is far more permeable than I ever imagined. And sometimes, when we seek transcendence with sufficient desperation, we find that transcendence seeks us in return. Not always in the form we expect, and not always with results we can easily categorize as blessing or curse. I still conduct my research on medieval mysticism, but now with the understanding that some experiences resist academic analysis. Some truths can only be lived, not studied, and some questions are more important than their answers. In the deepest hours of the night, when the world holds its breath and thoughts take on the weight of prayer, I listen. And sometimes in the space between heartbeats, I hear her whisper back. Story 13. Oh, the industrial loft had seemed perfect when I first walked through it. 1,800 square feet of exposed brick and polished concrete, with steel-framed windows that let in streams of amber light during the golden hour. The previous tenant had left behind a commercial-grade range and prep station, which sealed the deal for me. After 15 years working in cramped restaurant kitchens, the thought of having my own space to develop recipes and maybe start a catering business felt like freedom itself. I should have paid more attention to why the rent was so reasonable. Moving in took 3 days. I hauled my collection of knives, my copper pans, and boxes of kitchen equipment up the freight elevator, each trip echoing through the building's hollow corridors. The landlord, a thin man with nervous eyes who introduced himself only as Mr. Hendricks, handed over the keys without much ceremony. He mentioned that the building had been a textile factory in the 1940s, then a series of failed art studios and small businesses. When I asked why the last tenant left, he mumbled something about creative differences with the space and hurried away. The first week passed without incident. I spent my days organizing equipment and my evenings experimenting with new recipes. The acoustics were strange. Sounds seemed to travel in unexpected ways, footsteps from the floor above arriving as whispers, the rumble of traffic outside sometimes sounding like voices. But I attributed this to the building's age and industrial construction. Old buildings have their own personalities, their own quirks. It was on a Tuesday morning, while preparing mise en place for a batch of experimental sauces, that I noticed the first spoon was missing. I keep my tools meticulously organized. a habit beaten into me during my apprenticeship years ago. Every knife has its place, every spoon counted and arranged by size. The missing piece was a vintage silver soup spoon I'd inherited from my grandmother. Not expensive, but irreplaceable. I searched every drawer, every surface, even checked the dishwasher twice. Nothing. By Friday, 3 more spoons had vanished. All silver, all different sizes, all from the same inherited set. I began to suspect I was simply misplacing things in the chaos of settling in, though this explanation sat uneasily in my mind. I'd never been careless with kitchen tools. The weekend brought no relief. I found myself conducting inventory checks every few hours, counting and recounting my utensils like a paranoid accountant. The missing spoons haunted my peripheral vision. I'd catch myself reaching for them, muscle memory expecting their familiar weight, only to grasp empty air. Monday morning changed everything. I woke to find the 4 missing spoons arranged in a perfect line across my kitchen island, their surfaces reflecting the dawn light streaming through the east-facing windows. But these weren't the spoons I remembered. Each had been twisted, the handles bent at impossible angles, all pointing toward the same spot on the concrete floor near the building's original structural support column. My hands trembled as I picked up the first spoon. The metal was warm, as if it had been heated, and the distortion wasn't random. The curves followed an organic pattern, like plant stems reaching toward sunlight. The silver had developed a strange patina, a subtle iridescence that shifted between purple and green as I turned it in the light. I wanted to call someone, to share this impossibility with another human being. But who would believe me? The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps someone had a key, some former tenant or maintenance worker playing an elaborate prank. But the building's security was tight, and Mr. Hendricks had assured me I was the only key holder. The spoons continued pointing toward that spot on the floor, their twisted forms creating an arrow of silverware that couldn't be ignored. I found myself standing over the indicated area, studying the concrete for any sign of disturbance. The floor appeared seamless, professional poured concrete with a polished finish, but as I knelt and ran my hands across the surface, I felt the faintest variation in texture, a hairline crack forming an almost perfect rectangle, barely 2 feet square. That night I barely slept. Every sound in the building seemed amplified. The settling of old timber, the whisper of wind through gaps in window frames, the distant hum of the heating system. But underneath these familiar urban nighttime symphonies, I heard something else. A sound so subtle I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. It reminded me of breathing, deep and slow, as if the building itself was alive. Tuesday brought more disappearances. This time, it wasn't just spoons. A wooden mixing paddle vanished from its hook. My favorite whisk disappeared from its drawer. Even a rubber spatula went missing from the utensil crock where I'd placed it the night before. By Wednesday morning, they had all returned, twisted and pointing. The paddle had been carved into an impossible spiral, its wood grain following the unnatural curves as if it had grown that way. The whisk's wires had been rewoven into a delicate lattice that hurt to look at directly, the pattern seeming to shift and breathe in my peripheral vision. The spatula had been molded into something that resembled a reaching hand, its rubber surface bearing what looked like fingerprints, but not human ones, all pointing to the same spot. I spent that afternoon at the hardware store, returning with a small sledgehammer and a pry bar. The rational part of my mind screamed that I was losing my grip on reality, that normal people don't demolish their rental floors based on the positioning of twisted kitchen utensils. But the compulsion was stronger than reason. Something waited beneath that concrete, something that had been calling to my tools with patient persistence. The first blow of the hammer sent a spiderweb of cracks radiating from the impact point. The concrete was thinner than I'd expected, perhaps only a few inches thick. As I worked, careful to contain the debris and minimize the damage, a strange thing happened. The air in the loft began to change. It started as the faintest sweetness, so subtle I thought I might be imagining it. But with each chunk of concrete I removed, the scent grew stronger. Lavender. Not the artificial perfume of cleaning products or cheap candles, but the deep, complex fragrance of living lavender fields in full bloom. The The smell seemed to rise from the growing hole like visible breath, warming the air and carrying with it suggestions of summer afternoons and purple horizons. Beneath the concrete lay metal, a hatch or access panel set flush with the underlying surface. The steel was old but uncorroded, bearing the patina of age without rust. Around its edges, a perfect seal that explained how the lavender scent had been contained for decades, maybe longer. My hands found the recessed handle without conscious thought, and I lifted. The hatch opened on silent hinges, revealing a space that shouldn't have existed. Below lay not the building's basement or foundation, but what appeared to be a room carved from living rock. Smooth walls curved away into darkness, and the lavender scent rose from this hidden space like incense from an ancient temple. Warm air brushed my face, carrying with it the impossible fragrance and something else, the suggestion of movement in the darkness below. Not threatening, but purposeful, as if something down there had been waiting with infinite patience for this moment of discovery. I lowered myself through the hatch. The space was larger than it had appeared from above, the walls extending beyond the reach of the light filtering down from my loft. The floor beneath my feet was smooth stone, warm to the touch and faintly luminescent. The lavender scent was overwhelming here, not unpleasant but intense enough to make me lightheaded. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I began to make out details. The walls weren't carved. They were grown, organic curves that suggested this space had been shaped by something other than human hands. Along these walls, at regular intervals, stood pedestals of the same warm stone, and on each pedestal rested kitchen utensils. Hundreds of them. Spoons and forks, knives and whisks, spatulas and ladles, an entire culinary arsenal spanning decades, maybe centuries. All twisted into impossible forms, all pointing upward toward the hatch I'd just descended through. Some were made of metals I didn't recognize, their surfaces bearing the green patina of extreme age. Others looked contemporary, as if they'd been deposited recently. In the center of this underground gallery stood something that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a tree, or something tree-like. Its trunk and branches formed from what appeared to be silverware fused and grown together. Spoons and forks sprouted like leaves from twisted limbs, their surfaces reflecting the stone's faint luminescence. At its base, roots of braided copper wire disappeared into the floor. As I approached this impossible botanical hybrid, the air grew warmer, the lavender scent more intense. The tree seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, a slow heartbeat that I felt in my chest. And I understood, with a clarity that bypassed rational thought, that this was where my tools had gone. This was what had been calling to them, bending them, reshaping them into offerings for something that lived in the space between the possible and the impossible. I reached out to touch one of the spoon leaves, and the moment my skin made contact with the metal, the world changed. Suddenly I could see the history of this place, not with my eyes but with some deeper sense. The textile factory above had been built deliberately over this space, its concrete floor a seal rather than a foundation. Workers in the 1940s had known something was down here, something that called to metal and shaped it with patient purpose. They'd built the factory as a cover, a way to keep feeding it while keeping its existence secret. For decades, kitchen utensils from restaurants and homes across the city had found their way here. Lost spoons, missing knives, vanished whisks, all drawn by an intelligence that understood hunger but had never learned to satisfy it in conventional ways. It fed on the potential of these tools, the thousands of meals they might have prepared, the nourishment they might have provided. And now it had found me. I pulled my hand back from the tree, gasping as the visions faded, but the understanding remained. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't malevolent. It was simply hungry in a way that human concepts couldn't adequately describe. It had been feeding on the promise of sustenance, the potential energy stored in tools designed to create meals for longer than the city had existed. The warm air continued to flow around me, carrying its intoxicating lavender perfume, and I realized that I was no longer afraid. Instead, I felt a strange sense of completion, as if I'd found the missing piece of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving. My tools upstairs would continue to disappear and return transformed. This cycle would continue, had been continuing, would always continue. I climbed back through the hatch, sealed it, and carefully replaced the concrete. But I knew the seal was merely ceremonial now. The boundary between my kitchen and whatever lived beneath had been permanently breached. Over the following weeks, my cooking changed. The dishes I created carried flavors I couldn't explain, combinations that shouldn't have worked but somehow achieved a perfection that brought tears to the eyes of anyone who tasted them. Food critics began to take notice. Restaurant owners called with offers I'd dreamed of for years. But late at night, when the city settled into its restless sleep, I could smell lavender rising through the floorboards, and I understood that my success wasn't entirely my own. Something was feeding through me, using my hands and my recipes to taste the world it could never directly experience. My tools continued their nightly migrations, returning each morning more twisted than before, pointing always to that sealed rectangle in my floor. And I let them go, because I understood now that they were never truly mine to begin with. They belonged to something older, something that had been waiting beneath the concrete long before I arrived, and would continue waiting long after I was gone. The question that haunts me isn't whether this is real or some elaborate delusion born from isolation and the pressure of starting over. The question is whether it matters. My food has never been better. My career has never been more promising. And every night as I fall asleep to the scent of impossible lavender, I feel connected to something vast and patient and eternally hungry. Sometimes I catch myself planning to move, to find a new place, to escape whatever this relationship has become. But then I remember the tree of silverware, its spoon leaves catching and reflecting light that came from no visible source, and I know I'll never leave. Because in that moment of contact, I saw the truth that I haven't dared to fully acknowledge. The entity beneath my floor isn't the only one that's changed. My hands, when I cook now, move with a precision that isn't entirely human. The flavors I create come from knowledge I never learned. And sometimes, in the reflection of my knife blades, I glimpse eyes that don't look entirely like my own. The lavender grows stronger every night, and I find myself looking forward to the scent. Soon, I think, the distinction between the cook and the cooked, between the feeder and the fed, will disappear entirely, and I'm no longer sure I want to stop it. Story 14. The fluorescent lights in the security booth flickered their usual dying dance as I clocked in for another graveyard shift at Millfield Municipal Park. 23 years I'd been walking these paths, watching over empty playgrounds and silent trails, and I thought I knew every shadow, every sound, every trick the darkness could play on a man's mind. I was wrong. It started like any other Tuesday night in October. The autumn air carried that particular chill that seeps through your jacket and settles in your bones, and the wind made the oak trees whisper secrets I'd never learned to understand. My routine was carved in stone by now. Check the perimeter gates, walk the main trails, sweep the picnic areas, and repeat. Simple, predictable, safe. The radio on my belt crackled with static as I began my first round at 11:47 p.m. Dispatch had been quiet all week, not unusual for a Tuesday, when even the teenagers found better places to cause trouble than a municipal park. My flashlight cut through the darkness ahead of me, creating a narrow tunnel of visibility that somehow made the surrounding blackness feel even deeper. I was halfway through the east trail when I heard it. The sound came from somewhere deeper in the woods, past the maintained walking paths where the city's jurisdiction blurred into genuine wilderness. It was a metallic chiming, like a grandfather clock marking the hour, but wrong somehow. Too deep, too resonant. The kind of sound that seems to come from inside your own chest rather than from any external source. Bong. The single toll rolled through the trees, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw a flicker of light between the trunks. Not the steady glow of a campfire or flashlight, but something that pulsed and twisted like heat lightning trapped in amber. I stopped walking and listened. The park settled back into its normal symphony of rustling leaves and distant traffic, as if nothing had happened. My watch showed 12:03 a.m., close enough to midnight that my mind could rationalize the chiming as some church bell carried on the wind. though I knew there were no churches within 5 miles of the park. 20 minutes later, as I was checking the playground equipment, I heard it again. Bong. This time, the light was unmistakable. It bloomed between the trees like a slow-motion explosion, casting impossible shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The illumination lasted perhaps 3 seconds before fading, leaving me blinking purple afterimages and questioning what I'd actually seen. I keyed my radio. "Base, this is Unit 7. You getting any reports of unusual activity in the area? Maybe some kids with fireworks or something?" Static answered me for a long moment before Sarah's voice crackled through. "Negative, Unit 7. All quiet on the scanner. Everything okay out there?" "Yeah, just thought I saw some lights in the woods. Probably nothing." "Copy that. Let me know if you need backup." "Backup? Right." What was I going to tell them? That I was seeing unexplained lights and hearing phantom bells? That after 23 years of night security work, I was suddenly jumping at shadows like a rookie? I decided to investigate. The beam of my flashlight seemed weaker as I left the maintained trails and pushed into the wooded area where I'd seen the lights. The underbrush grabbed at my pants legs, and more than once I had to duck under low-hanging branches that I could have sworn weren't there during my daylight inspections of the park boundaries. The deeper I went, the more wrong everything felt. The air grew thick and still, as if the wind couldn't penetrate this far into the trees. My footsteps, which should have been muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves, seemed to echo with each step. Worst of all was the silence. No insects, no small animals rustling through the undergrowth, no night birds calling to each other. Just my breathing and the sound of my heart hammering against my ribs. That's when I found them. In a small clearing perhaps 50 yards from the nearest trail, 2 objects sat in the tall grass like they'd been waiting for me. The first was immediately recognizable. My work-issued cell phone, the one that should have been clipped to my belt at that very moment. I reached for my hip and felt nothing but empty air where the phone should have been. The second object made my blood run cold. It was an antique mantel clock, the kind you might find in your grandmother's parlor, with a brass pendulum that caught and reflected my flashlight beam. The clock face showed 11:47 p.m., exactly the time I'd started my shift. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was that the clock was ticking. Not the gentle tick-tock of a normal timepiece, but a deep, resonant sound that seemed to pulse through the ground beneath my feet. Each tick made the air shimmer slightly, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. And with each tick, the darkness at the edge of my vision seemed to press closer. I knelt and picked up my phone, half expecting it to crumble to dust in my hands like something from a fairy tale. Instead, it felt perfectly normal, solid, familiar, exactly as it should. The screen lit up when I pressed the power button, showing the same wallpaper photo of my niece that had been there for months. 17 missed calls, all from numbers I didn't recognize. No voicemails. As I straightened up, the clock chimed again. Bong. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the clock, from the trees, from inside my own skull. And with the chime, the world shifted. The clearing became brighter without any visible light source, and the shadows began to move with purpose, reaching toward me like grasping fingers. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the trees. In that erratic illumination, I caught glimpses of things that couldn't be there. My own footprints leading away from the clearing in directions I hadn't walked, multiple sets of them, as if I'd been circling this spot for hours. My own jacket hanging from a branch, though I was still wearing it. A sign that read, Millfield Municipal Park, stuck into the ground upside down, the metal twisted as if it had been planted there with tremendous force. The clock chimed again, and this time I saw the source of the impossible light. Each metallic toll tore a brief rent in the air itself, revealing something that hurt to look at directly. Not darkness, but a kind of anti-light that made my eyes water and my head spin. Through these tears in reality, I glimpsed movement. Shapes that might have been human if humans could exist in spaces where geometry worked differently. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, my flashlight beam bouncing uselessly ahead of me. Behind me, The clock continued its relentless chiming, each toll followed by that terrible ripping sound as reality bent and twisted around its presence. The light from those tears in the world cast my shadow in multiple directions simultaneously, creating a strobing effect that made it impossible to tell which way I was going. When I finally burst back onto the main trail, gasping and wild-eyed, I was shocked to discover that my watch showed 11:52 p.m. 5 minutes. I'd been in those woods for what felt like an hour, but only 5 minutes had passed. I keyed my radio with shaking hands. "Base, this is Unit 7. I think there might be someone in the woods. Squatters or something. They've got some kind of equipment." "Copy, Unit 7. Want me to call it in to the police?" I hesitated. What would I tell them? That I'd found my own phone in a place I'd never been, next to an antique clock that opened doorways in the air? That I'd seen myself walking in circles through a clearing that might not exist? "Negative, Base. False alarm. Probably just kids messing around. They're gone now." "Roger that. You sound a little spooked, Frank. Everything okay?" Everything was not okay. Nothing had been okay since I'd heard that first chime. But what could I say? For the rest of my shift, I stuck to the main paths, the well-lit areas, the places where the world felt solid and predictable. But I could feel something watching me from the tree line. Not malevolent exactly, but curious, patient, like it was waiting for me to understand something important. Every few minutes I checked my phone. Still there, still clipped to my belt where it belonged, still showing 17 missed calls from unknown numbers. When I tried to call one of them back, I got a recorded message. "The number you have dialed is not in service." At 3:17 a.m., I was doing paperwork in the booth when I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Slow, deliberate steps that stopped directly in front of the window. When I looked up, I saw my own reflection staring back at me, but the reflection was wearing a different uniform, one with a name tag that read Franklin instead of Frank, and there was something wrong with its eyes. The reflection smiled and tapped on the glass with one finger. I blinked, and it was gone. The clock on the wall showed 11:47 p.m. My shift was just beginning. I picked up my flashlight, checked that my phone was clipped to my belt, and stepped out into the October night. The air carried that particular chill that seeps through your jacket and settles in your bones, and the wind made the oak trees whisper secrets I was finally beginning to understand. In the distance, deeper in the woods than anyone should ever go, I could hear the faint sound of chiming. It was calling me back, and this time, I think I was ready to answer. After all, I had 23 years of experience walking these paths, watching over empty playgrounds and silent trails. I thought I knew every shadow, every sound, every trick the darkness could play on a man's mind. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was right. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. The clock was waiting, and time, all of it, every moment I'd ever lived or ever would, was running out.